All right, good morning, everybody. I don't have a gavel, so I'll knock, bring this meeting to order. As we've done in the past, and we'll continue to do, I'd like to have a moment of silence for those that paid the ultimate price for serving our country this morning for fire and law. You can go ahead and do that. Thank you. All right, very good. Thank you very much. We'll go ahead and move on to our first item on the agenda this morning, and that'd be the approval of our July 26 minutes. I have a motion to approve those. Questions? Right on the top. Click that. There you go. Move it towards you.
Got it. Just one. Can you hear? Is that on?
Yeah, just click it forward, and you kind of got to talk right into it.
How about that?
Yeah, there you go.
Just for the correction, it has me listed as in attendance, and I called in.
Correct.
So
that is good. Yeah, Mr. Lawson was on
conference call.
On the conference call. All right, very good. All right, we have a second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstain? All right, motion passes. All right, move on to our second agenda. We have some elections to take care of this morning for chair and vice chair.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, historically the way this works is that you would meet in August, have nominations, and then at your September meeting take the votes. Since the August meeting was canceled, you could do nominations and votes today. There are three positions in your rules of procedure that you need to vote on: chair, vice chair, and the employer rep to the administrative committee. All of those require nomination and a vote, and you would, if you want to do the elections today, you just need to make a motion to suspend your rule and have the elections today. So that would be the first motion and the first vote if you want to proceed with elections today. Mark?
So I move we suspend the rules and have our elections today.
Okay, we have a second from Mike Blake on that. Discussion? No discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Okay, motion passes for moving forward with our voting for our board elections today.
And Mr. Chair, members of the board, to the extent that you are already comfortable making a motion on any of those three positions, you can do so. If the board members want time to discuss any of that, they could ask for a brief recess to talk amongst yourselves about motions.
Okay, being that we have some new folks on the board, let's go ahead and have a quick administrative session, just in case there's any questions or anybody has any additional things to add to that. So can we do that?
Yeah, and you can either group around here, typically and figure out what you want to do for the three positions.
Okay. Can we just clear the room? Would that be easier?
For this, you don't have to go into executive session, so you don't need to clear the room.
Okay.
If you want to have all the discussion public, you can, or if you just want to, like in the past, the fire guys have gotten together and talked about, and the law enforcement guys, and then the employers and the legislators. But however you want to handle it, there's no rules around that.
Perfect. Well, let's just do it right here. Does anybody have any additional questions as far as
that's the cleanest
to how this procedure works? Steve kind of laid it out. Typically, we talk about it and then have a vote the following month. But I believe everyone here, I know I can speak for the law side, have had discussions with my constituents here on the board. I've talked to the fire side. Does anybody else have anything to add or any questions? Yes, go ahead, Paul.
Well, as far as the employer reps, I'm going to step down off the board soon, so I will withdraw my name from the nominations for that position.
Okay, are we picking up Paul for the record on a microphone? Yeah. Okay. Well, I heard Paul, and Paul mentioned that he was going to be stepping down soon, and so he was going to withdraw his name from any nominations. So thank you for that. Any others? Okay. Well, I don't see anybody with any concerns or questions at this point, so we'll go ahead and move forward with our elections, if that's okay.
Yeah. Just call for any nominations.
Yeah. Okay, so nominations for chair. Go ahead, Mark.
Yep, so I nominate Dennis Lawson for chair.
Okay, we have one nomination for Dennis Lawson. Any others? Okay, so just to be clear, Mike, you're seconding the nomination for Dennis? Yes. Correct, okay. All right. Yeah, any discussion on that? Okay. All those in favor of Dennis Lawson being the chair? Oh, I'm sorry.
If you want to be extremely formal in regard to procedure, excuse me, for the record, my name is Tor Jernad. I'm the Assistant Attorney General. You might ask for, you might repeatedly ask 3 times for any further nominations for a position. Since we're following the procedure to its fullest, and having received no nominations, I would suggest that you proceed, and I would commend you for following procedure to the fullest extent required.
Thank you. As always, I appreciate that, Tor. So just to be clear, we have one nomination. It's been seconded. Are there any other nominations? Okay. With no other nominations, then we're going to vote for Dennis Lawson for chair of Left 2 board. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Abstain? Okay, motion passes. Congratulations, Mr. Lawson. You're now the chair of the Left 2 board. All right. All right, we'll move on to our next election for the vice chair position. Are there any nominations for vice chair?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd
Yep.
nominate you, Jason Granneman, for vice chair.
I'm sorry? Second. There's a second. Okay, any other nominations for vice chair? Any other nominations for vice chair? Going once? Yes. Okay. With that being said, is there any discussion, any questions? In case you weren't, I am interested, and I will serve as your vice chair. Okay. With all that being said, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Against? And abstained. Okay, motion passes.
So, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, the final position is the employer representative on the administrative committee. I don't know if the employer representatives had a chance to talk before the meeting to discuss nominations or anything like that. Would you guys like a minute to talk amongst yourselves, or are you okay? Just okay. Yeah, want to take a brief 5-minute recess to give them a chance to talk.
Yeah, do we need to clear the room for that?
No, you don't need to clear the room. They can.
Okay, we're going to take a brief 5-minute recess so the employee reps can have a discussion regarding their nomination. Okay, our brief recess is over, and the employee representatives had a chance to have a brief sidebar. There was a question from the public to the Attorney General. I believe that question was answered.
Yes, Mr. Vice Chair. It's a concern was expressed regarding compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act, and that, of course, demands that all public body deliberations are held in open session unless a very specific exception would apply. At this point in time, it's my understanding from my presence here that a recess was called, and that some members discussed, or some members went off to do their own business, whatever that is. As such, it did not raise concerns on my part because there was not, in fact, a meeting. There was no continuation of the meeting itself. Having said that, I would urge the body, of course, to make every effort at every point in time to comply to the fullest extent practicable, and as such, to the extent that there are deliberations, that all those be held in public session. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for that. Okay. With that being said, we'll move on to our next Board of Election vote, and that would be for the employee representative for the Administrative Committee. Do we have any nominations? Yes, Mr. Golnick.
I would nominate a day for that position.
Okay, we have a second. Any discussion further? Nominations been made for Ade and sorry. Yeah. Are there any other nominations? Going once? Nominations going twice? All right. All those in favor of having Ade on the Admin Committee as a employee representative?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain? Okay. Motion carries. Congratulations, Ade. Thank you. And with that said, we have a new chair, and I'm happily passing on the chair responsibilities to Mr. Lawson this morning. And I'll go ahead and change seats with you. You good with that?
Okay, and Mr. Chair, while you're doing that, I'll introduce the next item on the agenda. The LUC 2 board, when it was first created, was created with the idea that the board would actually do benefit administration. Early on, the board decided that it made more sense to continue to have the Department of Retirement Systems do benefit administration and then periodically report to the board on how that was going. That report from DRS is in two components. Sometimes they're at the same meeting. This year they're not, but those components are related to how cost effectively DRS is administering benefits and then customer satisfaction. This presentation deals with the cost-effective management of DRS's benefits, and as has been the case, DRS has a very robust measuring process. They partner with an outside agency. I'm not going to talk any more details because I don't want to steal the thunder of the DRS representative who's making the presentation today. But that's the purpose behind this particular presentation. And with that, we'll have Mark Feldhausen from the Department of Retirement Systems come up and provide you with the results of this year's benchmarking study that DRS conducted.
Thank you, Steve. Members of the committee, my name is Mark Feldhausen. I'm the Budget and Performance Management Director at the Department of Retirement Systems. This service that I'm going to be talking about, the benchmarking effort that we go through, we've been actually doing since 1999, and I've been coordinating our effort since that time. Thank you, Steve, for not previewing the data and taking all my highlights, because you've seen this as well and you know the story behind it. First, to introduce the firm that we work with, CEM Benchmarking. They're based out of Toronto, Canada. They were founded in the early 90s, and it was in the mid to late 90s that they started looking at the pension administration aspect, because when they started out, they were looking at the cost effectiveness of investment management. the SIB does participate in this service, and they avail themselves of that portion of the service that CEM offers. They are the only firm that provides this service in the world. No one else has gotten into their space. No one else has decided to undertake public pension administration benchmarking. I am still waiting for someone else to kind of break into that business. It is, for those of us that like administration and are interested in this, it actually is quite an interesting service to participate in. And those that do participate in the service are a real interesting group of plans from around the world. Talking about the participants that were in the database last fiscal year, there were most of them in North America, 31 from the United States, 13 from Canada, various participants from Europe, also from Australia and the Middle East. They do have a participant from South Africa, and they are branching out into Central America and South America as well. So as this business continues to expand and they expand their service, one thing on this slide, it identifies that for the purposes of benchmarking data, our data is really compared to the other U.S. and Canadian systems. The other international systems have enough dissimilarities that it wouldn't make sense to bring them into the essentially a 1,000-question survey. So they have a little bit more unique surveys that are more customized to their plans. But they are available for best practice analyses and for bouncing ideas off of. So it is something that I find very interesting what they're doing actually internationally, because there are kind of little kernels, little ideas of things to pursue. In looking at the service that we get back, I'm going to be talking about our peer group. And even though there were 67 participants last year, it's roughly the Canadian and the U.S. systems that you'll actually see reflected in the data. But you will also see uniquely a peer group for DRS to give us a really good comparable group to be compared against. This map of the U.S., excluding Hawaii and Alaska, shows where those peers are located. Those are the dark teal states. The orange states have a participant, but they're not large enough to be in our peer group. And the cutoff that we've historically used is, do they have at least 250,000 active members and annuitants? We've maintained that cutoff because there really isn't a kind of a good statistical way to kind of slice it a little bit smaller without having it look like you were throwing out someone that actually is a valid peer. I've mentioned here the ones that I've underlined on the far right were new into the fiscal year 16 database. They weren't in fiscal year 15. The only U.S. system that is larger than DRS that didn't participate last year was New Jersey. And there's about a handful of states that would be large enough to be in our peer group, but they're smaller than us. And they were 2 systems out of New York, a system out of Alabama, one out of Georgia, and one out of Tennessee. CEM, we've worked on them over the years and through other networks to try to see if we could get someone from the Southeast. They were finally successful in getting Florida to participate, one of the larger U.S. systems, but they still haven't been able to convince anyone out of the Deep South. Georgia is possible within a year or so. One of the good points of having a nice peer group like this is, in addition to them being fairly comparable to us, it gives a very good database for statistical comparisons. So you can get statistical significance when they're doing the analysis because it is this size. The first item I'll talk about is total cost, but before I get into the data, you will see charts like this in my presentation, and this is how CEM represents all the participants in the column graph. The column that represents DRS will be the dark blue, almost navy blue column. The kind of medium blue columns are the larger U.S. systems that are in our peer group, and the lightest kind of blue-gray columns, those are the other participants. That would be the smaller U.S. systems and the Canadian systems. And total cost for pension administration, this is apples to apples. CEM, they have you take what you're reporting in administrative costs off your CAFR, and then they have you identify and isolate what is common public pension administration costs. So when they have anomalies, they want to make sure that you don't have your investment management costs in there. Those are handled in a different service. They want to make sure you don't have health care administration because pension administrators, some of them help administer health care. They administer to different degrees. We don't at all. So they try to really get this down to what are common costs for all of the administrators. They only want those in there. And then, of course, in the denominator, it's your active members and annuitants. What this shows here is that we're essentially in the lowest 25% or the lowest quartile of cost in the participants. And then let me click this again. This shows that over the last 4 years, we've consistently been lower cost than the peer group and then the all participant group. So it's a good item to bring up is that we are a low cost administrator at $62 relative to the peer median of 76 and the peer average of 83. Now, over the years, CEM has been trying to identify, why. Why do people cost difference? And this is really why they got into it. They started to notice in looking at the investment management side that there was this other side they weren't capturing, but that they varied, and they varied significantly between administrators. So then they, over the years, have tried to look at kind of singular cost drivers. Was it because of your complexity? Was it an issue of economies of scale? Was it because of the varying levels of service? Was it because of your IT costs, which can be a very large cost for a pension administrator? And they were never able to pin down one of them as being the factor that explained why costs differed. So what they do now is they identify multiple variables within their analysis so that you can see where you differ, and then you can kind of try to get at, well, why do you differ in that component or that area? In the case of DRS, this comparison looks at our cost of $61.52 relative to the peer average of $83.28. And in the kind of the roll-up comparisons that they look at, you see three smaller items off to the side. The one on economies of scale, this is one of the earliest ones that they looked at, and what they found was the very large systems, CalPERS, CalSTRS, Florida, some of the big New York systems, they really didn't benefit from being that large. Statistically, they would get a very small benefit from being larger, but the interesting thing that they found, CEM, was that it was actually, there was a disadvantage from not having economies of scale. So there was a noticeable statistical cutoff point. When you got smaller than having 50,000 active members and annuitants, then your cost per member started to climb very quickly. So in this instance, you see that our economies of scale only really benefits us about 50 cents per member, and that's because we're slightly larger than the median. We provide or perform a little bit less number of transactions per member, potentially because of the membership mix. There are differences in level of effort for providing service to retirees than it is providing service to active members versus providing service to the inactive members, which don't get counted into this equation, but they are reflected in another component of the survey. We also had lower other front office costs, but the two biggest ones there in the different shades of orange, you see more transactions per FTE, or what CEM referred to as productivity. And I'll talk a little bit about the capability of our IT systems, and that's something that we've developed over the decades. Whenever we're challenged with implementing something from the legislature, we typically take the approach of how can we build that into our systems so they will handle the transaction. And you do see that later on. So we do get more productivity per FTE. We also had lower costs per FTE, and there's actually multiple components in that. And that was the largest explanatory factor. But that looks at how much does it cost for you to put an FTE essentially in your building. It looks at your salary and benefits cost per FTE. It looks at the actual cost of your building, your rent, your utilities. It looks at the IT infrastructure costs. How much does it cost to put a computer on that person's desk, to hook them up to your phone system? And in all of those subcomponents of this, we are lower cost. Now, I mentioned service previously. In service, we have a score of 80. This is a composite score of probably about 40 or 50 different measures at a very low level of detail. And in measuring service, what CEM looks at is different components of in your interaction with the members. How quickly do you get back to them? Essentially, how responsive are you? How many channels do you allow them to complete transactions or interactions with you? How available are you? One of the metrics there is how many hours per week is your call center open? They also look at the quality of those services and whether or not you actually measure customer satisfaction across those different components of service. This is a measure where if you were to look at it over the almost 20 years we've been doing this, our score has been fairly close to the median, sitting within a couple points of the median. And when you look at the bottom line there, we actually score at or above the peer median in 9 of the 14 activity level measures as you start to kind of peel away and look at it in greater detail. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about service here because when CEM came to the conclusion that service was not a nice, clean predictor of cost, and I in previous years have used a graph that showed that it doesn't line up nicely upon a scale. When you look at where everyone goes on an XY graph, instead of getting to be low service, low cost, all the way up to high service, high cost, and sitting along that line, they really don't. It's like you kind of shot it with a shotgun. There's just dots all over that line. It doesn't line up nicely. And one of the things that CEM suggested at a conference was that they would reduce the amount of basically paper and time that they devoted to analyzing service. And the reaction that they got back from the audience, myself included, was no, don't do that. And that's because this is the area of the report that most all of us go to, because this tells us where we're doing things differently, where a peer or someone else out there is doing something quicker than us, better than us. They're actually doing something that we're maybe not even getting into. And even when you get further down into the details, where maybe they're doing something at a lower cost than us. So we responded back. We wanted them to retain this. One of the areas that they actually will go into a lot of detail is, what would it take to get you to a score of 100? And they have, how you would have to change the different types of service and the different levels of service. And one of the pages gets into, well, what were the top 5 things point value-wise to get us up to 100? And they also caution you, don't chase a high service score, primarily because that can lead to higher costs depending upon what you pursue, but also, is that something your members want you to do? Is it something that your stakeholders, your authorizing bodies want you to do? Because you could spend a lot of money doing something and end up with no benefit out the far side. Sure, we'd get a higher service score, we'd have spent a lot of money, no one would be happier with us. That would, from my perspective, would be a tremendous waste of resources. But we do mine the list, we look at it, but we also line it up with what are our customers, what is the authorizing environment asking us to do. And one of the things we're going to be able to see in our score next year is that we did undertake some work to look at our phone tree. So when members call in, some of the metrics that CEM counts is how quickly do they get to a knowledge worker. So in our case, how quickly do they get, once they call in, to one of our retirement specialists. They also look at how many menu layers you have, because it's more efficient if you have kind of a fewer layers in your phone tree. A lot of us have experienced phone trees. Well, in our case, we put a team together with all of the data that we had. Essentially, where do our members typically want to end up getting to? The people that are in our contact center, how is their dialogue going with members? What's the feedback we're getting from members? Well, what they were able to do is they were actually able to trim a layer out and then have the most used or most sought after numbers be the ones that are at the front. And then also use kind of more intuitive, more logical language that say, when you're listening to that, I want to push 2. Get people to that decision quicker. We will see a better score as a result of that next year. and it's something that our customers wanted us to do. But the other thing about that is that doesn't mean we're going to start leapfrogging our peers and moving further to the right, because all of our peers are doing the same thing. They're all trying to get better with member service. I talked a little bit about complexity. This was one that CEM looked into as well to find out if this explained why costs differ. And in this case, they do a relative complexity score with a lot of subcomponent scores, and DRS has nearly always been down on the far right-hand side. And a lot of that has to do with, this really measures the number of rule sets that you administer. Because we're an umbrella administrator, meaning we provide pension administration for multiple systems and plans, that gives us more rule sets to factor in. Another complicating factor that CEM factored in was that hybrid plans essentially mean you're really administering two plans. We call it Plan 3, but it has a DC component and a DB component. That gives you additional rule sets as well. Over the years, what has happened to this isn't so much that our complexity score has gotten lower, it's that others have started to catch up to us. And how they've been doing that is they're starting to do things that DRS in the state of Washington, our legislature, did in the 70s in creating the Plan 2s, and then in the 90s in creating the Plan 3s. Other states, other jurisdictions coming forward and actually putting in place sustainable plans instead of the old Plan 1s that they held on to for a lot longer than we did. That is causing the columns to catch up to us, and if any of them want to displace us, they're welcome to it. That's not going to reduce our complexity, though. We're still going to have the same level of complexity. Now, on this chart, this is the only one here, this slide, where I have two graphs, and that's because of the relationship between the two of them, and it is what we like to see. The top one looks at how much you spend on information technology, and the bottom one looks at the capability of your systems to provide service. In the top one, we spend 8% less on IT than the peer median. And on the bottom one, our service score there of capability of our systems of 85 is larger than the peer average of 81. Excuse me. And this is one that, as we continue to work on the modernization of our systems, this will start to creep up on the top, but we would anticipate that it also will start to move to the right and have even more capable systems as we bring online our legacy replacements. The important thing about the one on the bottom to think about is this really measures three different aspects of capability of the systems. It looks at how capable are your systems of providing self-service for your members. It looks at how capable are your systems of bringing data in from the employers, which is critical. And it also looks at how capable are your systems of providing services for your own team members. How many of the transactions do your systems handle so that people aren't having to do manual transactions? So finally, in response to one of the questions I received historically, it's like, well, why do you guys do this? Because it does require that we fill out about a 1,000-question survey. And it really is because we do get a comprehensive and independent analysis. The report we get back is about 300 pages long. It does give us a very intense data-driven comparison to our peers, which provides us good information to share with others. But it also gives us a very strong operational network of peers. So at any moment, we can put a question out to what's referred to as the peer network, bounce an idea off them, bounce an issue we're dealing with off them, how have they been dealing with this, get feedback directly from them. But finally, it really gives us a lot of ideas for continuous improvement. When you see that Missouri's doing something that we're not, we can go talk with Missouri. How did you guys implement this? And the good thing about this is they'll tell us. They'll share that information very freely with us. Even the international plans will share their data and their information. It's like we're all in this together. How can we all get better collectively? And that's kind of one of the interesting sidebars on this is that a lot of those, the expansion into other nations, if you will, has been because CEM has been contacted by representatives that are either starting up pension administration or they're kind of looking at revamping it, and they're trying to figure out how do the best plans do it. So they will actually reach out to CEM and say, I want to participate because I want to learn from the people that are measuring how they're doing this, that have the ideas. That's my presentation. Happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You identified benchmarks to get towards that 100 score, and you talked about, some cost versus the gain on that side. Have you looked at what we could do? To move up higher on that score? And
yes. Yeah, we've looked at it. In fact, you go through it kind of page by page and look at all the point values, but primarily it's where do these line up with what our customers would like us to do? And, early on it was, kind of low-hanging fruit.
Right.
Were there any items that we could do that, that'd be really easy. But then there's that value analysis of, well, is this something our customers would want us to do? And do we have the internal resource to do it? Maybe it's that we've got some money to do it, but do we have kind of the knowledge workers to be able to tackle it? If it's additional automation, is this basically taking one of my or two of my primary ITAS 6s off of a critical legislative implementation and having them go over and work on a service enhancement that it'll give me 0.75 points on the score, but it's really more important for them to be over here implementing this new piece of legislation. So there is that resource balancing as well.
Go ahead.
This was a really interesting presentation. Near the end, you talked about how you could go out and talk with your peer jurisdictions and get ideas.
Yes.
I assume the opposite happens, which is people come to DRS and say, geez, how did you do this? Are there examples where you've noted that your peers seem to think DRS is doing a particularly good job and want to know how you did it?
Yes. In fact, one of the things that CEM does is they coordinate a conference each year, and they will ask various administrators that they feel are representative of best practices to do presentations. We did a presentation many years ago on the implementation of the hybrid plans. One of our administrators went down, I think the presentation that year was down in California. Cal STRS co-hosted, and they did a presentation on that. I've done a presentation on our interaction with employers, getting data from employers, which brings up one of my really interesting stories and observations. When I was doing that presentation in one of the breakout sessions, and I had a couple individuals from one of the international groups looking up at me, and they had this puzzled look on their face. And so I paused and asked them, you look like you have a question. And they said, well, why is it that you have to work on getting data from your employers? Don't they just automatically send it to you and it's perfect when you get it? And the rest of the story was in their structure, their infrastructure within their country, all the employers are already electronically reporting. So they're all doing it electronically, so that's not an issue for them. And there is no issue there. It's just like the government says, you need to provide this data. Oh, okay, fine, we send the data in. There is no second thought to, well, geez, that's going to take some effort for me to report that to you. It'll be a little while. So to them, the aspect of providing service to employers, that is why they had this puzzled look. Culturally, they couldn't relate to that.
Any other questions? Ade?
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. I'm just wondering, the members, excuse me, in the group, do they have relatively the same number of employees, the same value of asset, and performing the same function?
There is, I don't have the slide up here that looks at a summary of how many members, and they also look at the different member groups you're providing service to. I mean, I could provide that to Steve, and he could get it out to you, so you could look at kind of that side-by-side comparison that really looks at kind of the diversity of all these participants. But that's where CEM narrows it down to just capture what are your administrative costs to provide common pension administration. There is a difference, though, in the structure of many of those. It would be more common for a public pension administration or administrator to also be responsible for investment management. We do have a fairly unique structure here in the state of Washington, but in working with some professors that have been looking at this, they think we might have hit on a good combination here in the state of Washington because we do such a good job with having kind of a focused administrator, a focused investment manager, and essentially a separate legislative entity that does your actuarial analysis. So kind of that split governance structure appears to work for us in a good combination, whereas they would see issues in other pension plans nationally where that's all consolidated under one silo.
I think that is, to a great extent, what I'm driving at, because we have, in the state of Washington, such a great hybrid system that actually allow for efficiency. But if we do not combine the cost together, it will make us appear extremely low in terms of cost. So that's where I'm getting to.
Yeah, and that's one of the things where when you look at how much of your cost you actually load into this to come up with the cost per member, you do have to isolate out and remove your investment management costs.
Okay.
So any of your administrative costs dealing with investments gets pushed off to the side and doesn't get factored in.
Into this.
Yeah. Any, like the costs that we have for deferred comp administration, that's off to the side and not factored in because that is not consistent and it's a voluntary program.
Okay.
So yeah, it really is a good apples to apples comparison.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Very good. Thank you. Mr. Nelson.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, the next item up on the agenda is the results of the independent annual financial audit. The LEF 2 board is a state agency, and as a result, we're audited by the state auditor's office. The state auditor's office has a schedule of periodically auditing state agencies, and for small state agencies, it doesn't happen every year. However, because the initiative that created the board specifically required an annual financial audit, in years where the state investment board or the state auditor is not auditing the agency, contract with a outside auditor from the recommended list provided by the state auditor's office to do that annual audit and then present those results to you. This year, the firm providing that audit is Steve Davis. Steve Davis has provided this similar service to the board in the past. And with that, I'll turn it over to Steve to give you the results of this year's audit.
All right. Okay, it's on. Thank you, Steve. I'm glad to be here to speak before the board. I understand there's several new people from the last time, so I'll be taking some questions at the end if you have any. I'm not going to take a whole lot of time here. I'm going to summarize the results. The product that the board gets is a letter that summarizes the audit process and my findings, and then there's also the financial statement package that includes an audit opinion on the schedule of expenditures. Now, this is not a full financial statement because the board does not have assets per se and so forth. What you have are just expenditures. You're given an appropriation, and so the schedule of expenditures is, look at how the appropriation was spent and whether or not you were in line with what was authorized. So I'm going to give you a couple of things. In the letter that summarizes my audit results, I'm just going to go over some of the highlights. This letter talks about the audit process and the responsibilities of the auditor versus the organization. And so my responsibility is to provide an audit of the schedule of expenditures. It's not to function in any form of management, tell management how to do things, or impose my will, if you will. I can make some suggestions, and management can either choose to accept those, or they could tell me, we disagree, or, that's a great idea, but right now we're not in a position to do it. So the things that I might put in a report, they're not a binding sort of thing. So that's kind of the audit process itself. I want to mention that in the financial statements, it's made up of the schedule of expenditures. Then there are notes to the schedule of expenditures, which provide a little background information about the organization, the basis of accounting that was used, and some other important pieces of information. So one of the items in the notes to the schedule of expenditures is a disclosure on commitments, which is one of the more significant disclosures in the notes. In that disclosure, it just talks about the fact that there is a lease on the office space, and it talks about the terms and projects out what those costs are going to be out in the future. Well, now you're in the final year of the lease, so it's only going to talk about the rest of 2017 in there. The other disclosure that I would say might be interesting to some people is the fact that a large part of the costs for the board is costs between other agencies within the state. So you've got the state actuary, the attorney general's office. Those sort of costs are a significant part of the cost of operations. And so there's a discussion in there that talks about what's called a related party, if you will, because you're all part of the state. So we have to disclose that. Those are all required disclosures. Some things that I need to communicate to the board at the end of the audit are included in this letter. For instance, one item is if I had any difficulties with management or staff, if they were stonewalling me, if they provided me with, they couldn't provide me with information, or the information they provided me was misleading or, in any way questionable, I would have to report that to you. And as in prior years, that was certainly not the case. Management and staff were very cooperative. I didn't run across anything that, raised any red flags or caused me any concern. I also have to report to you whether or not we found any significant misstatements in the schedule of expenditures or the accounting records, and once again, there were none. There weren't any adjustments that needed to be made or that I proposed to management. And that there were no disagreements between me and management. So, again, let's say I find something that's wrong with the records. Maybe let's say I find that there's some inappropriate costs being charged. And I feel that should be disclosed in the notes of the financial statements. Well, because the schedule of expenditures and notes, because it's not a full financial statement. Because that schedule and those notes are technically the organization's and not mine, management has a right to exclude anything that I say needs to go in there. And that would be a disagreement. Where I would then challenge that is in my auditor's report. I could then point that out, that we had this disagreement, and I just want to mention something to you that this is what's wrong with the schedule or with the notes. Once again, not an issue. Staff has always been, has taken their accountability, responsibilities very seriously, and have always been looking for recommendations from me. Is there something you notice that we could be doing better, we should be doing that we're not doing? And I know, in the past we found little minor things. I think a couple of years ago I suggested that they start using the travel and expense management system that the state provides to process all expense reimbursements and travel costs of staff and board members. They took that recommendation and ran with it, and I think it streamlines the process a little bit because you've got a lot more electronic approvals and review and so forth, whereas before, especially when you have board members scattered, you have to mail something or email something, and it's got to go to this person and so forth. Well, now it can all be done right online. So I think that's the last recommendation that I've had for the organization. The final item I wanted to point out, and we'll go over the actual schedule in a minute. This was the end of the biennium. So because the appropriations come for a 2-year period, but the audit is occurring on an annual basis, this schedule, this financial package, if you will, is different in year 2 of the biennium than it is in year 1. So because truly what the requirement is for an auditor to come in and audit the schedule of expenditures for that year. Well, early on in the process, it was decided that we should provide some supplementary schedules which provides biennium information because, quite frankly, the most important thing here is that at the end of the biennium, you don't go over budget. And so maybe in year 1, you were well under budget, but in year 2, you were over budget. But overall, you stayed under budget for the whole biennium. Well, you're good to go. If, let's say, I presented a budget to actual for year 2 and you were over budget, people might think, well, we can't have that. Well, again, it's the appropriations for the biennium. The annual amounts are allotted as a mechanism to kind of keep control of the budget over that 2-year period. So you don't spend everything you have in year 1 and then run out of money in year 2. So I do want to mention that my auditor's report, which is on page 1 and 2 of the financial statement or the schedule package, it's a clean opinion. So I had no qualifications to my opinion. So the schedule does present fairly in all material respects what took place during the year. The schedule itself, I do want to point out that there were a few line items that were over budget for the biennium, but these were just line items, and that's not a problem. The overall budget, you were well underneath the biennium budget, so everything was in compliance. And there's, typically there's some reasons for things going over budget from one biennium to the next. In this package, the main schedule is the schedule of expenditures where we show the budget to actual and the variance. And once again, the requirement is to do it on a year basis, but the true meat and potatoes here is on the biennium, which is in the supplementary schedule. So in the back, the last two pages of this whole packet, there's a schedule that that's provided that shows a comparison between the current year and the previous year of the biennium. So we're showing both years, and then a total for the whole year of expenditures. And this is just provided for additional information because sometimes when you look at one single year, you look at it and you go, okay, well, I don't know what that really means. What was it like last year? Are we staying in line with things, or did something happen this year that was unique that maybe I've got a question about? So the information is presented there as a supplementary item, and I want to point out that you'll notice that personal service contracts and then the Attorney General's office expenditures were significantly higher in year 2 of the biennium than year 1. Well, a good portion of that is there was the potential merger of plans, and there was some legal looking into, well, how does that play out and so forth. I know you're all much more familiar with what was going on there. I'm more focused on the financial aspect and the transactions, but that was something that was looked into as far as possible merging of plans and what that might mean. So those costs kind of increased because of that. The last page of the whole financial package is a just shows the biennium budget to actual and each line item where you were over or under budget on. And the items where you were over budget on, most of them were insignificant. You're talking a couple $100, maybe a couple $1,000. The biggest one was under employee development, where it was overspent by $8,000. Well, one of the things that's included in that line item is all the costs of memberships and so forth were in there. And, I had questioned whether or not memberships belong in there, but when I look at the alternatives within the statewide accounting system, I really couldn't find any place that really said this is where membership should go. Maybe there was an other category you could have put it in, but I felt that since the memberships and many of those memberships were specific to employees, they were a member of this organization because primarily so they could get training or get access to resources that help them do their job better. So I thought, okay, employee development works for me there. But again, as the biennium goes, you were a little over $28,000 under your appropriations budget for the biennium. So there's nothing to report as far as any findings or possible findings there. So when I do take a look at the audit, as I look at things, I do try to, although I'm not doing a compliance audit per se, I do try to kind of put on a state auditor's hat to see, okay, if the state auditor were to come in here, is there something in here that I'm looking at that might cause them some heartburn, so that, I can let Steve and the staff know, hey, here's something that, might cause a little bit of concern here, so that they can address it up front rather than have it come out if the state auditor looks at it and so forth. And once again, I didn't see anything this year, but again, I'm looking at samples of transactions and so forth, and I am not specifically going in and saying, I'm going to look at this account because I know this year the state auditor has made that a hot button issue or something. I'm not privileged to that, so I don't look at it as a much broader look at that. So anyway, otherwise, the whole thing went smooth. I want to thank Steve and his staff once again for making it a pleasure to work with you guys, making sure that everything I needed was there when I needed it, and I feel that the audit went relatively smoothly, and we got it done in a timely fashion. So if you have any questions for me, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Questions?
Thank you very much. How much was the audit cost?
It was $6,000.
Okay. Will that be reported under the other purchased services?
It's going to be, I hope I can remember which one it was recorded under. Let me just take a look here.
I think it might be under contracts.
Yeah, but which one would it? It would either be under the personal service contracts, which is probably where it was at. It could also have been. No, I'm sorry. It could be there, or it could be under other purchase services. But I'm almost certain it is under the third line item called personal service contracts.
Okay, $7,370.
So for the year ended June 30th, 2017, we had $55,827 there. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
In that line item.
Okay.
So.
How long have you done the audit?
Pretty much since the start. Gosh, how long has that been? 2001?
Yeah, when the board was first created, we coordinated with the state auditor's office. I can't remember the year that they did the first audit. The board, I think, started doing the annual audits beginning in 2004. As I mentioned earlier, Steve Davis was on the auditor's list that if you use somebody from this, I don't want to call them preferred or whatever, but if you use somebody from this list, we will rely on their work when we come in to do our periodic audit every 5 years. And so I believe every year that the state auditor hasn't done the audit, Davis Accounting, Steve Davis has.
Yeah, I think there was one year I did not come in and do an audit. That was early on. I think the state auditor had come in. It was maybe the second or third year that I was involved with this. They decided they were going to come in and do a full-blown audit. And so I think that year we did not do it. But normally what they've been doing is just a real cursory review and relying on a lot of the work that I do, yes.
Yeah.
Comments? Questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very good. All right, Mr. Nelson.
All right. Next up on the agenda, we've got two different presentations on the same topic. By way of reminder, one of the assignments that the Left 2 board got this interim from the legislature was to conduct a study on interrupted military service credit. Currently, if you get called up to service in the military and it calls you away from your left position and then you come back, depending on the nature of your military service, whether it's in combat or not, whether it's during a declared conflict or not, depending on your role, what type of service you provided during that conflict, statute provides you receive service credit for that at no cost to the member, or the member just pays their regular contributions, depending on the type of service. There was a bill last session that would have expanded the amount of no-cost interrupted military service. And by no cost, that's no cost to the member. It simply means the cost of that is subsidized over the plan, and all the rest of the members and the employers in the state pay for it. But that bill was converted into this study. This is the kind of the initial presentation, but a little bit more detail. We have Seth Miller from the Department of Retirement Systems. They administer all the interrupted military service. He can tell you how the process works and answer questions with you. As we mentioned early on, a number of different kind of, I don't want to call them technical, but a number of different administrative questions have come up throughout this, separate and apart from the idea of expanding no-cost military service is also how's the current process working. Seth, I'll turn it over to you to sort of present that piece of it, and then Ryan from the board will follow Seth also on this same topic.
Perfect. So, yeah, my name is Seth Miller. I'm Assistant Director from the Retirement Services Division. I think Steve just covered everything I was planning on covering, so this should be relatively quick, which is perfect. So we gave this presentation to the Select Committee on Pension Policy a couple of months ago, so for those of you may have seen it before. We want to make sure you saw the same information. And I'm just going to touch on a few very small issues that we want to make sure you're aware of. And specifically, I'm just going to talk about interruptive military service. And that is exactly what it sounds like. Someone is working for an employer. They are called up to provide service to one branch of the military, and then they return to employment at a later date. When they do that, they will provide the department with usually a copy of their DD-214 that shows what their service was. We review that. And so for interruptive military service, they have the opportunity to purchase that time back. They pay, the member, the employee pays their portion of the contributions that would have been paid had they been working. And then when they do that, the employer is billed for their portion. So that's, in general, how interruptive military service works. There's another version of that referred to as no-cost interruptive military service, and basically the exact same scenario, except for that service has to fall under the definition of a period of war as defined in statute. And so I'm going to dive a little bit more into what that means and how it's written and some of the challenges that come around with period of war. So specifically in statute, period of war defines a number of different things. And for the wars that are listed here, they're exactly what you think. Anyone who served during World War I or World War II, Persian Gulf War, would be considered to have served during a period of war. So pretty straightforward for those declared periods of wars that have a specific time period. Though I'll get to one technical thing about the Persian Gulf War that I just want to point out. Also within the definition of period of war, it lists a number of armed conflicts. So you'll recognize some of these, and we also, in this presentation, listed where these conflicts happened. So you'll probably recognize Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom. So those are things we are looking for when a person turns in their DD-214. Are one of these operations listed as they served during that time period in one of those operations? So, and this is where it can get a little confusing and complicated for a member. When it talks about period of war, it specifically says for those listed conflicts that a person has to have been awarded a campaign badge or medal. And campaign badge has a very specific meaning for the Department of Defense. And the way we included the definition from the Department of Defense, but really the way we think about it is someone has served in a combat zone or the theater of war or in imminent danger, kind of is the way to think about it. The Department of Defense actually awards 3 different types of medals or 3 different tiers of medals, depending on how a person served in one of those conflicts. And campaign badges or medals fall into the tier 1. Meaning someone, as I said, really in combat areas in where the actual combat is happening. And then there are Tier 2 and Tier 3 medals. Tier 2, often think of someone maybe for Iraqi freedom who was serving in Kuwait or the United Arab Emirates, somewhere in relative proximity and in support of, but not in the direct combat zone. And then a Tier 3 medal is a service medal. We've seen folks who have served at the Pentagon, people who have served at the Joint Base, actually called up away from their actual employment, but served relatively locally, sometimes still living at their house and just commuting to a different location. So to qualify for the no-cost benefit, the person has to have earned one of the Tier 1 medals. And this is where it can become difficult, where the law is very clear, and we want to make sure we're still honoring the service. The person under federal law has the ability to purchase that service back, and the state is required to allow them the opportunity to purchase that service back. But the state has taken an additional step, as Steve mentioned, to subsidize those no-cost situations for people who meet certain criteria. So that's the general overview of how it works. A few of the issues that we have run into in administering this, and some of these we've been challenged on, and some of them we haven't been challenged on yet, but may in the future. So I mentioned the Persian Gulf War as being listed as one of those wars, and specifically in statute it says the Persian Gulf War, which began on August 2nd, 1990, and ending on the date prescribed by a presidential proclamation of law or law. There was never a proclamation or no law was passed by the federal government. So some folks may make the argument that the Persian Gulf War is still going on and that any military service that they provide, whether it's at the Pentagon or the Joint Base, that they should earn no-cost military credit. We've taken the position that the Department of Defense stopped awarding medals in 1995 for the Persian Gulf War, and we consider that to be the end of the war. But it is, the statute makes it a little bit more unclear. We think it's a very reasonable position, but it would be nice if it was a little cleaner in statute. And then of the listed conflicts, Noble Eagle is one of the conflicts that is listed, but the Department of Defense has never issued any campaign badge or medal. And so that can cause confusion as well. A person served in support and earned one of those Tier 2 or Tier 3 medals for Operation Noble Eagle and will rightfully state that they had no opportunity for that higher Tier 1 medal. And then we've just started running into the last bullet there. There are a couple of more recent conflicts where people are earning campaign badges or medals, Inherent Resolve and Freedom Sentinel, where those conflicts are not currently listed in statute in the definition of a period of war. We haven't had someone come to us with both criteria yet, but it is only a matter of time probably before a person will qualify in that way. And we hope something happens before then as far as the law change goes. So that's my brief overview. I know Ryan's going to go into a lot more depth kind of, about everything that you're required to say. So if there are any questions.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Appreciate your presentation. I have some questions. I think some fall in your wheelhouse, some might fall in Ryan's wheelhouse. I have several members in my organization that are always in some type of deployment. And a lot of questions have come up, and of course, for some reason, I'm always perceived as the resident expert on these things.
Which is one of the reasons I wanted to present this to all of you, because I'm sure you feel lots of very technical questions about it.
Absolutely, yeah. And so on the buyback, an often a question I get, and some of these I think I know, but you're here, so I'm going to take full advantage of that. So I apologize to the board if some of these are basic, but I want to leave today with a real solid understanding on how these work. And so I'm going to ask you some questions.
Yeah.
So
and hopefully we're not stealing all of Ryan's presentation
right,
as well. So.
Hopefully not. Sorry, Ryan. On the actual versus actuarial buyback.
Oh, yes.
Right. So if a member is afforded the opportunity to buy back, is the let's say they're deployed stateside, right? So in support of, so they're not in theater, so no one is paying their share, but they have the opportunity to purchase what their contributions would have been.
Correct.
Is that the actual dollar amount, or is that the end actuarial value?
Yeah, so if they have 5 years from returning to active employment, it would be just actual cost. So no interest is even charged, so in that way it's slightly subsidized. But they have 5 years to pay what the contributions that would have come out of their check had they been working. If they go beyond that, it becomes much more expensive and becomes actuarial, the opportunity for an actuarial purchase.
Thank you. And what about the employer's contribution during that time where, again, we're not in theater, let's say we're stateside in support of?
Employer would pay the contributions as if the person had been working. And once again, no interest.
Just for clarification on that, is that based upon the employee taking action first?
Correct. Yeah. So for any purchase of service credit, whether it's military or someone goes out on a temporary duty disability L&I claim, the member has to initiate the action to then create a bill for the employer.
And is it the same 5-year timeline on that where they can go back and ask the employer for their contributions, or is that more of an employee-employer? As far as, let's say I'm deployed, I'm in theater, or I'm at a theater, I've contacted DRS, I'd like the opportunity to purchase my contributions, right, at my contribution rate, but my employer, had me on inactive, pay status, so now I would like to request from my employer their contribution rate be added to my left account.
Yeah, they that's more of a technical thing, that the employer portion actually goes and funds the overall pension fund. It's not applied specifically to your account. Right. So once you pay your contributions and they go into your account, the employer is automatically billed and has to pay because we have ways of making the employers collect. And so they get paid into the overall pension fund.
Okay, that answers that question. So there's a fail-safe there where, I'm going to buy it, I'm going to pay it, and then DRS is going to go, hey, Mr. Employer.
Yeah, you're done at that. Once you pay, you're done. You don't have to worry about what the employer's going to do.
Okay. And my last question is on, so there's been a lot of questions on DD-214s.
Yes.
On annotations, and I'm sure you're full aware, and maybe the folks here are and aren't, but there's a block in there. And in that block, you referred to, there's kind of a description for campaign medals, ribbons, any awards, citations, et cetera. There's also typically unit citations. In those unit citations, it typically will state that this unit was deployed to this theater in support of, or it could say this unit was deployed in theater and sometimes it'll actually list a battle. But that information typically doesn't come directly from DoD. It actually comes from your unit. So your unit provides that information to DoD, and then DoD puts that information in your DD-214 upon discharge. Or if it's not, I know service members have the capability to petition DoD to update their DD-214. And just so everyone's aware, the DD-214 document you get when you are discharged from the military. So with all that being said, on the RCW and the listing of the actual wars and, of course, the actual conflicts, which is more common these days, does it meet the qualifications if your unit provides that information to the DoD? And just as long as it's on there, because I've had several members who are in specialty units, let's say, and get deployed and then come back, and their deployments aren't necessarily listed on there, on their DD-214. So they've gone to their units and said, hey, I need this added on here specifically for Left 2, because they're Left 2 members. And their units say, oh, sure, no problem, and they make that petition to DoD, and then DoD will note it, but sometimes DoD doesn't reissue the DD-214. Would a documentation or an amendment from a unit suffice?
Yeah, absolutely. We work as hard as we can with the members to try to get whatever documentation they have available. I mean, just to be completely honest, the DD-214 is difficult for us to read and translate. I mean, it's not our language. And so we try to, if they have additional certificates or travel papers or anything that can help show where they were at, what they earned, we can get there. And so, yeah, it's not just a DD-214 that we're looking for. And we realize that sometimes they're not updated in a timely manner, and that can cause challenges as well.
Okay, that answers that question. Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Had a question on kind of language interpretation on called up versus enlist, commission, leave employment. So if I recall correctly, it was if you leave employment to go for a conflict. So is that different between the called up, as in they're an active reservist or something along those lines, or if a conflict starts to occur and a member decides to enlist or commission? I mean, is there a difference of leaving employment or prior? When do they already have the position, or if they decide to join?
Yeah. So I think your question's good, and I didn't hit on it very clearly. We're really talking about they had employment and they went on some leave of absence with the employer. There have been cases where a person enlisted and separated from their employer and said, the employer has no expectation for that person to return to employment. I think that's kind of the criteria that we would be looking for. And that can cause some confusion as well, definitely for the employer, and what was communicated when the person left.
Follow-up question. So, just a theoretical, I know there's a lot of what-ifs out there, but, say a person signs up for their 4-year commitment. I mean, that would be within the 5-year time frame, and they say, hey, I'm going to be back 4 years down the road, assuming they don't force me to stay. I mean, would that kind of fall under that called up or leaving employment, I guess? It could.
It could. It would depend on how they handled their separation from their employer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's kind of a follow-up question, Mike's question. It's an interesting notion. So we're talking about kind of a voluntary call-up, whereas there's a conflict and I volunteer because I have some kind of specialty and so I do it, versus being called up. So I have multiple examples of that in my agency. I have people who were voluntold, so to speak, where their organization says, hey, we're going to need you for this operation, this conflict, and so they don't have a choice. But I've also had members who are, current active reserve, depending on whatever the branch may be, and then a conflict comes up, and then they'll say, hey, I would like to serve in this capacity.
Yeah.
And so they leave. And that is always done. Both of those examples I gave you were not like, hey, I'm not coming back. It's I'm going on a 1-year deployment.
Yeah, and they would be handled the same way.
So regardless if it's if I'm mandated to serve or if I'm volunteering to serve, either way I'm still in some type of inactive duty in a military branch.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant which one.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Nice job. Mr. Nelson.
As a follow-up to how the current practice is being worked that Seth just talked about, Ryan's going to get back into the study. And again, the study now kind of has two components, if you will. One is the policy issue. Does the board want to make a recommendation to the legislature one way or another about the idea of expanding no-cost interruptive military service? The legislation last session, for instance, would have eliminated the campaign or medal requirement. And so no-cost interruptive service would have been provided to all members who served during one of those armed conflicts, whether the service was in theater, in support, whether it was Tier 1, 2, or 3 instead of just Tier 1. So that's policy question one for you in the study is, do you want to expand that or not? Policy question two, which Ryan's also going to talk about, is now what do you want to do, if anything, regarding these correction issues that have been identified by DRS with the current process? And with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan to go into those issues with more detail.
Okay.
In more detail.
Thanks, Steve. Members of the board, for the record, Ryan Frost, board staff. To begin, I wanted to expand a little bit on one of Jason's questions about the contributions and who pays and the 5-year rule. So if the member has until through 5 years to pay the actual cost, and then they have before retirement to pay with the actuarial cost. There's a few different time frames about interest, how interest applies. So after 1994, the member would pay their contributions with no interest, but there is interest on the employer and state share of their contributions. And then there's also some periods before that, between 92 and 94, the member would have had to pay their contributions plus interest. And then before that, from plan inception to 92, the member would have had to pay both the employer and the member contributions plus interest. So it really depends on when that service was. That's important for how much interest you're going to pay and who's responsible for it. So I just wanted to get that out of the way before I got started.
Hey, Ryan, is your mic on?
It says it is, but it's not close enough.
All right. Yeah.
Just got to almost. All right, so as Seth and Steve mentioned a little bit, the issue that the Senate wants us to study is veterans who have served during a designated conflict period but do not earn a campaign badge or medal must pay member contributions to receive their Left Plan 2 credit for periods of interruptive military service. As they mentioned, there are some definitions of veteran issues that we'll get into towards the end of this presentation. So again, Seth mentioned this, but Left Plan 2 members may establish up to 5 years of paid or 5 years of no-cost service credit for military service interrupting their left service. So they can have a total of 10 years, but only 5 of that can be no cost. And member contributions are waived for those members who served in the military during wartime or during a specified conflict where they earned that Tier 1 badge that Seth had mentioned. And the Senate Bill 5661 directly tasked the board with studying should members of Left 2 who are veterans of specified conflicts not during a period of war and where they were not awarded a campaign badge or medal also receive up to 5 years of free service credit, and also what would be the cost of that. Seth went over this mostly, so in essence of time, I'll skip over this a little bit. But basically, contributions are waived if the member is defined as a veteran under 4104.005. Campaign medals, Seth also went over this a little bit, but as he mentioned, they really want to specify that they're recognizing service members who are deployed to the geographic area where the combat's actually occurring in order to receive that campaign medal and the free service credit. And that'll come into play a little bit when I talk about how other states view no-cost service credit. All right, so a little bit of Left 2 data. Since June 2012, there's been 187 Left 2 members who have taken advantage of interrupted military service credit. The average service credit bought by those members was 9.3 months. And there was also a table done by the Select Committee on Pension Policy staff. They actually were the ones that did the comparison between Washington State's eligibility, their costs, and the credit amounts with 8 other peer states. And they considered peer states states with a similar military presence as Washington. And what they found was that of the 5 states which offered no cost interrupted military service credit, Washington was the only state that required that service must be during a period of war or that they earned a campaign badge or medal. So we're a little bit stricter than the peer states on how we administer the free service credit. But some data still needs to be researched. As I mentioned, what will be the cost to Left 2 if these no cost service credit was expanded to more members? How many additional members would become eligible for the waiver? And how many members who had already paid contributions for these periods for service they've already rendered would be eligible for a refund? And then when we get to the 2 different policy issues, should the current policy continue where free and interrupted military service credit is only granted to those members who earn the Tier 1 badge or medal? And then the second kind of separate policy issue is, does the board want to make corrections to the current definition of veteran? And Seth went over 3 of them. There, I have 4 total that we found. The first one is if a member goes on multiple calls to the same conflict, they only get a campaign badge or medal for that first call. So they won't get it when they go back. Let's say they go out 3 months, come back, work for 6, go to the same conflict for 3 more. They only get a campaign badge medal for those first 3. The second issue, as Seth mentioned, there's no end date in statute for the Gulf War under the definition of veteran. There's only a ceasefire, no presidential proclamation was called. So they're administering it as the ceasefire is the end date, but to clean it up in statute would be preferable. Also, the Operation Noble Eagle was named in that definition, but no campaign badges or medals were ever administered. And then the 2 current operations, which the IRS can award no cross service credit because they're not actually named in those defined conflicts in statute. So any future defined conflicts are going to have to be basically re-added into the definition of veteran every time they come up, as it currently stands, or else they can't offer that no cost. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys have.
Jason, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your presentation, Ryan. In your research, so in addressing the theater conundrum and campaign ribbon, and then multiple deployments to the same place, is there any indication as so when I served in theater in the first Gulf War, regardless of whether or not there was a combat issue, or a campaign medal issued, which I don't, to my knowledge, wasn't the case because there were people graduating boot camp during the first Gulf War who the first ribbon they got upon graduation was a campaign ribbon because all of the armed forces were engaged in the first Gulf War.
Because it was during a wartime. Right.
Correct, exactly. So, but outside of that, there's a hazard pay inclusion that is basically is if you're in the armed forces and if you're in a theater of combat, you automatically get that hazard pay. Okay. Did you see anything like that, or do you think that would be helpful in clarifying what is a theater versus not a theater?
Yeah, it would absolutely be helpful. as Seth mentioned, a lot of this is up to their current interpretation of how the campaign badges and medals are awarded. As far as hazard pay, I haven't seen anything in my research that would show if that would qualify or if that would be helpful.
Sure, that generally doesn't show up on a DD 214. That would obviously be in a payroll record,
Right.
but I don't know if that would help or that might create more of a challenge trying to get that data.
Yeah, I mean, you can ask Seth if that would help them most, but I haven't seen anything about the hazard pay in the research I've done on what's on the DD and what qualifies.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for you, Ryan, but Jason might even be able to answer too.
Okay.
Do we have a comparison of what a member that's called up and serving, what their pension benefit would be during that time that they are serving through their federal or military pension system? And if not, can we get that for future?
As it pertains to Left 2 or their
no,
federal?
Their federal.
Their federal?
Yeah. Can we get that for future
sure.
information?
Any other questions? Nay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ryan, for the presentation. When do you think we will be able to know how much the cost will be if we were to go this route? How much the cost will be for the Left 2, and how much the cost will be for the employer?
Well, the hope when we were tasked with the study is to come up with the cost by our final report to the legislature, which is due January 1st. So that would be the last day that the final day that we would hope to have the costs in place and known. But for us, we would hope to have it by our final presentation in December of what the whole cost would be.
Okay, thank you.
Regarding the covered contributions for a member, just to be clear for myself, if they're in theater, their costs are being covered. The employer is paying their contribution, right, just like they normally would. Is that correct?
Yeah, if the member wants to purchase that service credit.
Well, this would be if the state is covering. So if the member's eligible and they're in theater and they've met that eligibility requirement, the state's going to pay the member's contributions, correct?
Yeah, it's socialized over the plan, but more or less.
The contributions are paid when the member comes back and requests the bill. They're not paid while the member is serving. I wasn't quite sure.
Correct. Yep, I get that. I'm just trying to make a determination between the employer versus the state.
The state share of the contributions is billed at the same time as the employer share, and which is after the member makes their payment.
Correct. But the payment that is being paid on the member's behalf is wholly paid by the state, correct?
No. The employer pays 30% and the state pays 20%, just like for regular contributions.
Correct. Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Go ahead. So I think so we're all clear, no one pays the member's contribution in that circumstance, if I'm correct, and instead it just becomes a cost to the fund. Right. Okay.
Correct.
Questions?
By way of process, just so that you understand, with a study like this, it'll be on your agenda again for November, at which time we'll discuss some of the policy options, and then you'll be voting on the final report at your December meeting. So you'll see this topic again in November. I'm not sure if we'll have cost information by then, but then it will also be on the agenda again for December. That's when you'll take action, and our goal is to have all the cost information at least by December, if not November. It's a bit of a challenge. The data For instance, we know who's already contacted DRS, who's bought the service because they qualified or got the no cost because they qualified, who paid for interruptive because they didn't qualify. It's a bit challenging, though, to find data on people who, well, I know I didn't qualify for pre-service, so I didn't even bother contacting DRS because I didn't want to buy it. You know, we could maybe figure out who was on leaves of absence, but we have no idea whether that leave of absence was for military service or for some other reason completely unrelated to disability or unrelated to military service. It could have been a personal leave, an educational leave, disciplinary, who knows. But there's a number of reasons. And so trying to cross-reference databases like state employees, left membership, who are all local government employees, with some of this other stuff, that's where the challenge has been. The actuary, when they had to do a fiscal note on this bill during session, at that time they were unable to calculate the costs, and their fiscal note was indeterminate. We're hoping to do better than that given the entire interim, but it is challenging right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I would just like to ask the board that even though this is a real good thing for us to explore, but before we make final decision to actually understand the cost, you know, I think we are all going through a very trying time that, you know, the state is going through trying times, so are some of us, the city. So before we make final decision that we fully understand and have the information on the total cost.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no idea if the legislature would be open to this, but is one of the options to address some of these administrative challenges, such as conflicts that have come up since the statute was amended? Are we looking at the option of having the legislature grant the ability to make the list basically to like the DRS director, so you wouldn't have to constantly be amending the statute? Is that one of the options that we're exploring?
That is one of the options that we could bring to you, either that it automatically cross-references the federal DOD definition of what a term of conflict will be. That'll avoid this regular periodic update type of issue that comes up.
And one of the other issues is that this definition of veteran affects all the plans, not just Left 2. So we would want at least to have some coordination with the other.
I was going to ask you that question. SCPP, have they taken up this discussion as well?
Yes. Now, thank you. At the May meeting of the SCPP, So for the Select Committee on Pension Policy, at their May meeting, they asked for a presentation. They like to keep tabs on what is the left board working on so that they can kind of see where efforts might align or overlap. And this study came up. They had a presentation in June, and they decided at that time not to work on the issue any further. There were some legislators who were interested in looking at the no-cost issue, some committee members who were interested in looking at the correction issues. There were also some committee members who were interested in looking at expanding it even beyond that to include military service that took place prior to the employee's state or public service.
Not interrupted.
But in the end, they decided, let's just table this. At the last meeting of the Select Committee, they asked for an update on where is the left board on certain issues, and I spoke to this study. They asked me at that time if I would be willing to give them an update again at their future meetings about your progress on this study, with the idea then that depending on your final report recommendation in December, they may, at their December meeting, which comes after yours, choose to endorse what you have done and have it be a joint recommendation that would end up applying to all the plans on behalf of both the SCPP and the LEF2 board. Because at this point in time, that's unclear, but it certainly would be inconsistent if, for instance, on the correction issue, if you went through and corrected some of these issues that DRS is dealing with, but those corrections only applied to LEF2 and they didn't apply to PERS and TERS, the Select Committee understands that's not a ideal solution. It is also possible that if the board recommended a bill, regardless of what the bill ends up having in it, it could be amended during the legislative process to include all the plans. That happened a couple years ago when the board recommended the retiree annuity purchase option. That recommendation was for LEF2 only, but it was subsequently amended by the legislature to include LEF1 and the State Patrol. So that's another possible way that the coordination on this issue could happen. Any other questions on coordination?
All right. Ryan?
Okay. I'm still sitting here for the
I know,
next
you're going to do your next one?
presentation, So I'll
Yeah,
let Steve go ahead.
You want to do your introduction?
Question for the board. The next item on the agenda is the benefit improvement pricing, which would be Ryan. However, we also have the report on financial condition, the economic forecast assumption presentation by the state actuary. They are all here, happen to be here now. If you would like to adjust the agenda and move them up, is that something you'd like?
Yeah, without objection. We'll move number 9, correct?
Yes.
We will. Are they ready to go? Yeah. Without objection, we'll bring up number 9.
I hope they're ready to go and I didn't just make them all angry. By way of introduction, as they're getting set up, every 2 years, the Office of the State Actuary issues a report on long-term economic assumptions, which includes a recommendation from the state actuary about any changes to those assumptions or not. The state actuary makes that recommendation to the Pension Funding Council. They also make that recommendation to the LEF2 board. So this is part of the regular 2-year process. The LEF2 board has the unusual statutory obligation compared to you're the only plan. This board adopts the long-term economic assumptions, the actuarial assumptions for the plan. All the other plans, those assumptions are adopted by the Pension Funding Council. With that, I will turn it over to the team from OSA, and I'll let you guys decide how you're going to introduce yourself and take it from here.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I'm Lisa Wan with the State Actuary's Office, and we have a panel here today to try and keep the excitement level up for you. Starting to my right is Mitch DeCamp. He's an actuarial analyst with our office, and to his right, Matt Smith is our state actuary. And we're going to split this into 3 groups, but there are 2 main reports that we're going to go over, and these are reports that our office has recently published. The 2 reports are the report on financial condition and the economic experience study results that also include recommendations on your long-term economic assumptions. We have links to the full reports in your meeting materials, so if this isn't quite enough, and maybe you're having trouble sleeping tonight, you could go and read the rest of the fascinating information. And just as a reminder, no action is required at today's meeting, so really this is an opportunity for you to listen and learn. And I believe action regarding long-term economic assumptions will be at a future board meeting for you. So with that, I'm going to dive into the first section, and then Mitch and Matt will follow up with the economic experience study results and recommendations on long-term economic assumptions. So key takeaways from the report on financial condition. Now, just for some more background, this report is prepared for all the Washington State retirement plans. So we don't prepare reports specifically for each plan. So you're going to hear a lot about the other plans as well, and hopefully that provides you with some context for how the financial condition of LEF 2 compares to the financial condition of the other retirement plans, and also gives you a sense for some of the concerns or maybe difficulties or challenges that the state is facing in other areas. So in developing this report, our office prepared both a framework and a set of tools to assess plan health. We're hoping that we can continue to use that same framework and set of tools in future reports so that we'll have this consistent review and monitoring of plan health over the years. And we're also hopeful that this report will help decision makers when they're evaluating those long-term economic assumption recommendations that Matt and Mitch will be sharing with you next. So in developing our framework, we really wanted to provide a more complete picture of retirement plan health. So we start with where we are today, what's our current status, and that's typically results you see in your annual actuarial evaluation report. But then we want to look at, well, where's the plan health expected to be in the future? Because that's also important, right? Where are we going? And one thing we do know about the future is we don't know what the future is. So we're also going to look at how can that look different. So what are some of those risks that our retirement plans face? And we'll wrap up with, can we monitor and control some of those risks? So that was the framework, and then we chose two tools to assess plan health, affordability and solvency. Affordability really gets to the question of whether members, employers in the state can pay those contributions that are required to fully fund the plan. Are those requirements affordable? Solvency is measured by funded status, and that looks at whether the plan right now has enough assets to pay the benefits that members have earned to date. So that's the measure of funded status. And we use these two tools because we really feel that balancing both affordability and solvency is key in both achieving plan health and also maintaining it. And the reason this balance is important is because improving one of those measures often will weaken the other. So if I can give you an example, if you have a plan that's 80% funded, right, has 80% of the assets needed to pay current benefits that have been earned, and you want to focus on getting that to 100%, that's going to require a lot of additional contributions to get there, and then you're now weakening that affordability measure. So balancing solvency and affordability is really key. And it can be difficult when we're in challenging times to balance those. So when we start looking at the different measures, we're looking at the current state of the plans, and some might consider this challenging times. If we look at the first row of data, that's the Public Employees Retirement System, 4 years ago, the total employer contribution rate for PERS was 9.03%. Today, that rate is 12.52%. These contribution rates today are the highest we've seen in plan history. Now, if we look at LEF 2, LEF 2 has been, over the past several years, adopting the 100% of the entry age normal cost, which is considered the long-term cost of the plan, and so you're not seeing the same kind of increases as some of the other plans. And also, too, for a lot of these plans, they still have those legacy costs that you're probably familiar with, the PERS 1 and TERS 1 unfunded liabilities. So those also have an impact on the increasing rates.
Question on, or I guess clarifying question on that. So the LEF employer contributions are both the employer and the state's portion for those local governments. Are there any others that split in between the state and employer?
Volfire, that would be the only other one that.
Okay, but none in the charts.
Right.
None in this chart, though.
Correct.
So the actual employer cost is less. The percentage of contribution is less for local government employers.
For Left Plan 2?
Yes.
Correct.
Thank you.
That's correct. Yes, it would be 60% of that rate there. And then the state is the 40%. So in these challenging high contribution rate times, as we would expect, the state contributions as a portion of the state budget are also high. In 2016, 4.3% of the general fund state budget are going towards retirement plan. Now, this is a similar level to what we experienced in the late 80s and early 90s, but it is the highest level we've seen over the last 20 years. The second tool that I mentioned earlier is solvency or funded status. As I mentioned, is just a reminder, it's comparing the plan assets to the benefits members have earned to date. So it's a measure at that point in time. And if your funded status exceeds 100%, it means you have enough plan assets to cover the benefits that have been earned. So looking at the current funded status, if we go to the far right, that shows the total for all plans combined, and it has decreased from the prior year from 87% down to 86%. Left Plan 2 has also seen a similar decline from 107 to 105%. And some of the big drivers of that overall plan funded status would be our PERS 1 and TERS 1 plans that have those unfunded legacy costs. Both of those plans are under 65% funded. In other words, they have less than 65% of the assets to pay the benefits that have been earned to date. Now, the state is making additional contributions to those plans to get them fully funded, and I'll speak to that in just a few minutes. So that was a quick look at where the plan health measures are today. So how do we expect those plan health measures to continue in the future? Our office has developed a projection model that projects valuation results for the next 50 years by plan. Now, this model assumes that future experience will match the assumptions. So it assumes, for example, for Left Plan 2, that the plan will continue to earn 7.5% interest for the next 50 years. So it assumes that the plan experience is exactly what the assumptions are. And the results of our projection model is showing that both affordability and solvency improve. Now, contribution rates for the plans are expected to decline to their long-term levels. Now, as a reminder, Left Plan 2 has been adopting that long-term rate, so you will not see the same kind of changes in contribution rates, but still moving to that long-term level. And the contributions as a percent of the general fund budget from the state to all retirement plans is also expected to decline. If you recall that table, in 2016, it's 4.3%. It will go up to 5.2% in 2020 and then decline to more of a long-term level of 2.3% out in 2035. So that's what we're seeing for projections for these affordability measures. Looking at the contribution rates themselves, again, let's start with the PERS plan. We talked about it right now at 12.52%. We're expecting that to decline to 10.7% in the 2023-25 biennium, and it will continue to decline even lower. Left Plan 2, just a reminder what we're showing on this table. The board has at this point adopted 8.75% through the 1921 biennium. So that has been adopted at this point. The board can change that. And then what we're showing beyond that is your long-term policy, which is 90% of the entry age. So if we actually looked at these numbers under what you have been adopting, 100% of the entry age, they would be slightly higher than 8.75. And the second measure, or second tool, is solvency. Again, assuming actual experience matches our assumptions over the long term, we are expecting all of the open plans to have a funded status of 95% or higher by 2023. As we saw, LEF 2 is already over 100%, so we expect that to continue. And those unfunded legacy costs for PERS 1 and TERS 1, we are expecting the TERS 1 to be paid off by 2028 and PERS 1 by 2030. So once we hit those payoff dates, the requirement for contributions for those employers will decrease quite a bit. So then moving on to how can this look different? There are several things that we have to make assumptions about, one being demographics. So when we do our projections, we are assuming that new members are coming into the plan to replace people that are leaving. Plus, there's also generally a little bit of growth in that plan. And when we're assuming new members, we have to assume their age, their gender, their salary, and how many of them there are. And those can be different. So that can change the results of the projections we looked at. Investment experience can also be different. LEF Plan 2 has a 7.5% assumption. The other plans are all currently at 7.7%. That the investment experience could be higher or lower. We could also have periods of high volatility in those future investment returns. And also legislative action can be different than what we assume for our projections. The legislature may not fund those required contribution levels, or they could adopt new plan benefits or new tiers of benefits. So those are all things that can make these results look different. So our office developed a model to look at how these can look different. We have a risk assessment model we use in our office. It generates 2,000 scenarios of randomly simulated economic outlooks. We also have built into this model the ability to assess the risk of continuing what we call past practices. And we've defined these past practices as funding shortfalls or benefit improvements that are consistent with what we've seen in the historical plan experience. Okay, so we can measure both of these with our risk assessment model. So now we're going to have a look at what this will show us. So starting here, we're going to look at affordability first, then we're going to look at the solvency measures. This graph shows, and this is all plans combined, the contributions as a percent of the general fund state budget. So recall, we're right now at 4.3%, expected to go up to 5.2%, and then trend to this more long-term level around the low 2.3%. So this is assuming everything happens as expected. If we allow the economic environment to change, which is mainly driven by your investment return assumption, the results could look like this. These two lines, 90% of our simulated results fall within these lines. But it does give you an idea of how much volatility there can be in these results. And then if we additionally overlay that past practices, we see this result. And again, 90% is falling between those two purple lines. Next, we'll move to the solvency measure or funded status. Now, this is our closed plans. So the closed plans 1, combined funded status. This is what we expect to see, this black line. When we look at how investment returns could impact the results. This is what we see again, 90% of the simulations falling within those two red lines. And then overlaying on top of that, past practices, this is how that changes. So it gives you a sense for, how wide the results could be from what we're expecting. And then when we move to our open plans, now left Plan 2 is included in this. We could, if the board is interested, show the results specifically for left 2 at a future board meeting. But this is all the open plans combined expected funded status. You can see we're at that 80, I think it was 87%, and trending up and above 100% in the future on an expected basis. Add economic scenarios to this, 90% falling between those two red lines, and overlaying that with past practices, this is what we see. So these charts are really just giving you a sense for the risks that are inherent in our retirement plans. So then the question becomes, well, can we manage some of these? And so this gives you a sense for some active risk management that decision makers can employ. Starting at the left, measuring the risks is using our risk assessment model. We can use our model to measure what are the risks for a specific retirement plan. And then once you see those, are any of them outside your level of tolerance? And if they are, can we manage some of that? Can we make some adjustments to be able to manage and mitigate that risk? Making reasonable and timely contributions, in other words, fully funding the systems when those contributions are due. As we know, a lot of our benefits are paid by investment returns, so you need to get those contributions in to take advantage of those investment earnings. Affordable and sustainable plan designs, so thoughtful consideration about benefit improvements, particularly benefit improvements that cover past service, because past service hasn't been funded yet. So if you increase benefits for past service, that's going to add another layer of extra contributions to get that past service funded. And finally, reasonable assumptions, because adopting reasonable assumptions, which is the next section that Mitch and Matt are going to speak to, leads to reasonable funding of your plans. So my concluding remarks. There is current pressure on both affordability and solvency, particularly for some of the other plans and with those legacy costs. But the future measures of plan health are expected to improve. Again, balancing that solvency and affordability is key, and employing active risk management will also help keep the plans healthy, improve their health, and help them become sustainable over the long term. So that is the end of my section and the report on financial condition. And unless there's any questions specific to that, I will be passing this over to Mitch and Matt.
Any questions? All right. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Well, members of the board, for the record, my name is Mitch DeCamp, and as Lisa said, we're now turning to the economic assumption portion of the presentation. And before we dive into these assumptions, I want to cover two things. That is the purpose of the assumptions we're going to discuss today, and then the measurement period over which we set them. So starting with the purpose, all actuarial assumptions are always set consistent with the purpose of the measurement. And in this case, the purpose of the measurement is to determine the ongoing funding requirements of the state retirement system. And for the presentation today, particularly LEP 2. As for the measurement period, this can vary by assumption, but these are typically long-term assumptions, so they're covering 30 and in some cases 50 plus years. Now, if we were to set these assumptions over a different measurement period, they might be very different than the assumptions we're going to discuss today. So with that out of the way, what are we setting these assumptions to fund? Well, we're setting the assumptions to fund this, and this is the left to total projected benefit payments based off of our latest actuarial valuation report. A couple key things to point out here. As of 2016, we are expected to pay out about $250 million in benefit payments, and that is expected to increase to over $2 billion in about 35 to 40 years. I also want to bring your attention to the width of the curve here. From 2016 all the way to the end of the plan, that's about 80 years. So that really speaks to the long-term nature of LEF 2's obligations, as well as the long-term nature of the assumptions we need to set in order to fund these obligations. So the next thing I want to touch on is how the investment returns play into LEF 2 funding. So if we added up all of those benefit payments we looked at on the prior slide, they total $101 billion. Now the present value of that $101 billion is $13 billion, and that is the impact of investment returns. I wanted to show this to you to really highlight the power of investment earnings and what a very important assumption this is for the funding of LEF 2, and why we're going to spend so long talking about that assumption today. So what assumptions did we take a look at as part of this study? Well, the first one we looked at was inflation, and we use it to model post-retirement COLAs, or cost of living adjustments. And these are based on changes in the consumer price index for Seattle, Tacoma, and Bremerton. Now, the use of that index is set in statute, so that's not our choice to use inflation based off that index. The other thing we use inflation for is a building block to the other assumptions, and I will touch on that a little further in a couple slides. And then the next assumption we looked at was general salary growth, and we use that assumption to project member salaries into the future to help determine members' retirement benefits, as well as contribution rates, which are set as a percentage of payroll. I also want to point out something important about this general salary growth assumption. This is the economic piece of salary growth that applies to all state retirement system members. So it's the same assumption for everybody. There is a different assumption, the demographic piece of salary growth, that captures differences in types of members. So teachers and firefighters, we expect their salaries to grow at different rates, and so and that's all handled by the demographic piece of the assumption. So we have two different assumptions there. We did not study the demographic piece as part of this study, but that will be next year as part of the demographic experience study. So general salary growth applies to everybody, same assumption for everybody. And then finally, the investment return assumption, and we use that to determine today's value of future benefit payments, as you saw on the prior slide, as well as today's value of salaries. So this is the process, the general process that we went through in setting each assumption. We first reviewed historical data, how have these economic factors been moving historically, and then we looked at forecasts, and we looked at more forecasts. We looked at a lot of forecasts for this study. We wanted to get a broad range of what various experts in the field think these economic factors are going to be in the future. And then finally, we land on our new recommended assumption, which is what we are bringing to you here today. One more thing before we jump into the first assumption is we developed these assumptions as a consistent set of economic assumptions, and we recommend reviewing them as a consistent set of assumptions. So no cherry picking, please. So it all begins with inflation, and this is a representation of what I meant by the building block approach we took with inflation. So starting on the bottom left of the slide here, inflation is represented by this blue block, and that's the first assumption we set. So we first set that underlying inflation assumption. Then moving over to the general salary growth assumption, we use that same underlying inflation building block and then layer on top of it a real salary growth assumption, which is just all salary growth above inflation. So the combination of inflation and real salary growth, both those components together, gets us to our total general salary growth assumption. And it's a similar process for investment returns. Once again, same base building block, inflation, and then layering on top of that the real rate of return to get the total investment return assumption. So inflation, how did we set that first building block? Once again, started with that historical data, and what did we see when we looked at the historical data? Well, we noticed that inflation has been low for the past few decades. Forecasts, well, the forecasters say in the short term, these low levels of inflation are expected to persist. In the long term, most forecasters agree that inflation is going to rise. To the ultimate level can depend on the forecaster as well as to the length of their forecast. And finally, this gets us to our recommendation, and we are recommending lowering the inflation assumption from 3% down to 2.75. And that 2.75 actually has two components itself, and that's the national inflation assumption as well as a regional adjustment that we tag on top of it. And we get this regional adjustment from looking at national and regional inflation as measured by that Seattle-Tacoma-Bremerton CPI. And we've noticed that over the last 30 years that Seattle-Tacoma-Bremerton inflation has been above that national inflation by about 0.3%. So that's where that regional adjustment comes from. And I'm going to talk through some of the data we looked at to set both of these assumptions in the coming slides. So this is historical inflation over the last 30 years. And the national inflation is represented by the dotted blue line, and the solid green line is the Seattle-Tacoma-Bremerton inflation. So you can see that downward trend in inflation over the last 30 years, with the last 10 years of inflation being a little lower than the rest. And the other key point in this is that Seattle-Tacoma-Bremerton inflation, so that solid green line, is above the national inflation line for most of this projection period, besides for a few years in the mid-2000s and a couple years following the Great Recession. Now, on average, that line is above the national inflation by about 0.3%, which is where we get that regional adjustment factor from. Forecasts. This is what I mean by a lot of forecasts. There's a lot going on in this, so I'm going to break it down quickly. At the top of the slide, the solid lines, the green and blue solid lines, those are long-term forecasts provided by Global Insight and the Social Security Administration. They are longer-term in nature, go out about 40 to 50 years, and they are projecting national inflation at about 2.6 to 2.7%. The short-term forecasters, a little bit different. These forecasts come from the Congressional Budget Office and the Economic Revenue Forecast Council. After an initial short-term dip, their ultimate rate of inflation is around 2.25 to 2.4%. And what we did is we set our national inflation assumption about right in the middle of the long and short-term forecasts. So we take that new U.S. inflation assumption right in the middle, 2.45%, layer on top of that the regional adjustment of 0.3%, which gets us to our new total inflation assumption of 2.75%. So the next assumption we're going to look at is the real salary growth assumption. And if you remember back to that building block slide, that was that small yellow building block that we layered on top of the inflation assumption to get to the total general salary growth assumption. So we studied this for all Plan 2-3 members. If you recall, the assumption applies equally to all members, all active members of the state retirement systems. So we studied all their data combined. And we did restrict it to just Plan 2-3 members, as they represent the vast majority of current active members, as well as Plan 2-3 are the only remaining open plans. So what we did is we took salary growth over the last 30 years. We removed the inflation component from each year. We removed the demographic component. And what's left is the real salary growth. We did make one other change for outliers, and what we noticed is that following the Great Recession, there was a period of negative real salary growth. Now, we use this real salary growth assumption for about a 30-year period, while typically the Great Recession is viewed as a 1 in 100-year event. So we're not exactly expecting another Great Recession over the measurement period that we're going to be using this assumption. So we adjusted, we removed that outlier negative real salary growth following the Great Recession. And after we made that adjustment, we noticed that real salary growth has been pretty stable over the last 30 years. In terms of forecasts, well, short-term and long-term forecasts in this case are the same at 1.2%. The Congressional Budget Office goes out 10 years at 1.2%. Social Security Administration goes out 75 years, also at 1.2%. Unfortunately, we can't really compare their forecast to our assumption, and that's because these forecasters combine the economic and demographic components of salary growth, whereas in our model we have them split. But what we can take away is that short and long-term forecasts are the same at 1.2%, and they are also virtually unchanged from what both of these agencies projected 2 years ago, which brings us to our recommendation, also unchanged, real salary growth remaining at 0.75%. Very important note here, though, the general salary growth assumption is going down from 3.75 to 3.5%, and that is due to that lower inflation building block, 3% down to 2.75. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about a little bit of that historical data we looked at to get to that unchanged 0.75 real salary growth assumption.
I have a question.
Sure.
So when you're comparing the different plans in the state of Washington with each other, does the state actuary's office give any consideration to the difference in the collective bargaining laws that apply to LEF and non-LEF employees? Does that play into your calculations at all, or your forecast?
Well, for looking at the historical data, yeah, that will definitely be in the historical data. In terms of this assumption, remember this is that base economic salary growth building block. I think a lot of what you're discussing, that collective bargaining, those jumps in salary, that's going to come through that demographic component. Okay. And we didn't study that as part of this study. So this is just that same across the board for everybody. Any other? So here is the real salary growth figures that we came up with for all Plan 2-3 members over the last 30 years. So the dark bars there, that is with the inclusion of that negative real salary growth figure following the Great Recession that we believe is an outlier. As you can see, it has a pretty large impact on the averages. So then adjusting that, removing that piece gets us to the green bars, which, as you can see, over the last 30 years is pretty stable at 0.75%, which led us to no change in our assumption. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Matt to cover investment returns.
Mr. Chair, do you mind if I stand? Sure, please. I'd like to just take a little bit of a break. A lot of information to process, a lot of speaking, so sort of a deep breath as we go into the bigger section of the presentation that Mitch alluded to. And can I use the mic? No. Hopefully I don't strangle anybody here. So, first of all, in terms of projections for OSA and OSA's future, I'd say pretty bright with people like Mitch and Lisa on staff. But investment returns, so worth the extra time. And I'm going to follow the same format as Mitch, cover the highlights first, and then get into some of the details, just a few more details that we'll cover for investment return. Starting with the historical data, when we look at what's actually occurred over the last 10, 20, 30 years, for the first time in my career, reporting that we have periods where the actual performance is below the assumption. I think that, kind of look at that two ways, glass half full, half empty. It speaks to how well the State Investment Board has performed. This is the first time I think we've reported a 10 or a 20-year period below the assumption. But it also speaks to we're in different times. The forecasts, we work very closely with the State Investment Board and their capital market assumptions. A key input into our process. They're expecting lower rates of return than what they previously estimated. They focus on a 15-year time frame. So Mitch talked about this earlier, the importance of the measurement period. Understand that the State Investment Board is only providing a 15-year forecast. That's insufficient when you think of that mountain graph, right? That can go out for 80 years. So we have to use our professional judgment to take those assumptions, extend it out over a much longer time period. So don't be surprised when we start talking about adjustments. That's what I mean. And then we get to a recommendation of 7.4 coming down from your current assumption of 7.5. And down below I show you how that breaks out between national inflation and the real rate of return. So it's a little bit of a nerd moment here, but we're using the national inflation here because this portfolio, right, is global as well. So we don't need the regional part of this assumption because the CTF, if you will, is not a regionally invested portfolio. It's global. There are assets in our region, but it's not a majority share of the investment portfolio by any means. So we use national inflation as the building block here, not national plus regional. All right, following the same format as Mitch, I'm going to walk through some of the data, just some of the highlights, starting with historical investment performance. So this is the graph that supports my earlier statement, where you notice that the 10-year return and the 20-year return, the average annual return, 5.63 and 7.66. Of course, my point I noticed earlier, I'm comparing this to 7.7, so obviously 7.6 is above 7.5 for the 20-year period. And then we see some longer-term periods of the 30-year look back, and then the last 5 years, we've seen a nice bounce back from the Great Recession. The blue and the green are just breaking out the inflation and the real rate of return, so similar to that graph that Mitch showed you. The blue bar, that's your real rate of return. Green bar is inflation. So the rest of the presentation is going to focus on forecast. But before we get into forecast, I want to talk about asset allocation because it really does matter. And this graph on the left shows you the target asset allocation for, I mentioned CTF, I should have said commingled trust fund, right? Your portfolio. It's in the same portfolio as all the other retirement systems. You have your share in that. That's how it's invested. 37% in global equity, 23% in private equity, 20% in fixed income, 15% in real estate, and a small amount in tangibles. That's not your typical portfolio, right? You talk to people that you might work with who don't have a pension system, or perhaps you have a 401k. I doubt you're investing your 401k that way, or that you have access to those investments. So you wouldn't expect the same types of return. You might also not expect as much volatility as this portfolio. The other thing is that all public plans do not invest the same way. So that segment there to private equity and real estate and tangibles, those are called private market investments. Washington State has more invested in that category than their peers. So that means we should expect to earn higher returns. Not a guarantee, but past practice suggests that those segments are going to produce higher returns, but also a little bit more volatility every year. So now we're going to go through a series of charts where we drill down to some of the data. I mentioned earlier that the State Investment Board, WSIB, expects lower returns than they did previously. This chart shows you some of those data points. Maybe just kind of focus in on the middle, the median return. 2 years ago, the median 50-year annual return from SIB was 7.74. 2 years later, based on their latest data, they're saying 7.34. So 40 basis point reduction. Now we can take their capital market assumptions that apply for 15 years, project them over 50 years to start to get a sense for what future returns might look like. The median return literally splits the distribution in half. So like Lisa mentioned, if we did 2,000 simulations for the next 50 years, half above 734, half below 734. Kind of like a coin flip, if you will. 50-50 chance if the assumptions are right that you're going to hit your return target. We do know, as Lisa mentioned, our assumptions will be wrong. Anybody who sets assumptions knows that. Doesn't mean you don't set them. You just need to know how much could you be wrong and how much does it impact your forecast. So simulated returns can change when we use different assumptions. So we don't want to overwhelm you with data, and I hope this doesn't, but we picked the two largest asset classes. You think back to that pie chart, private equity and global equity. If we just vary those returns, the annual expected returns by 1 percentage point, higher or lower, what happens to the returns? So if we work our way from left to right, we saw earlier that if everything happens as expected, we have a 7.34% annual return over the next 50 years, annual average return. If private equity is 1% lower, that goes down to 7.11. If it's 1% higher, it would go up to 7.57. Now, because global equity is the largest component of the portfolio, if that experiences a 1% lower return, we'd actually have a return that goes down just slightly below 7% over a 50-year period. If it were 1% higher, we could go back up to 7.7 approximately. So a fair amount of sensitivity, nothing to ignore by any means. So before we kind of get to the recommendation, I wanted to kind of recap and maybe go into a little bit more detail for, how did we get there? So you saw the first three steps summarized. We looked at historical data. So that graph we talked about, the bar charts with the green and the blue, that's actual CTF performance, right? You can't argue that, right? I mean, that's history. That's what actually happened. Periods above and below the benchmark. We also look at those historical returns and the conditions that were present during that time. We don't want to, this exercise is not just looking at the last 30 years and going, the average was this, so here's our assumption. We need to be mindful of whether those conditions are going to exist in the future. The last 30 years, very interesting times. Periods of really strong market performance and really, really poor market performance. Are those going to continue? I don't think they will in the exact form. We also look at simulations. And just a few more data points here. Remember that we looked at the State Investment Board's capital market assumptions, CMAs, 15-year period, and their inflation assumption is 2.2. Their national inflation assumption is 2.2. That's different than the one we use. So we'll talk about that later. We had to adjust for that. And then they also assume that private equity, in their capital market assumptions, is going to earn 300 percentage points more than global equity. So for example, if the annual global equity return is 8.5%, 1 year arithmetic basis, they think private equity will earn 11.5%. Just a flat out add to the assumption. So a very critical data point when we look at expectations for the future. We also looked at how the simulations could change under different assumptions. Remember that was the table with what happens if global equity or private equity perform differently? Fair amount of sensitivity. So before we got to the recommendation, we had to make some adjustments, which I will talk about here in more detail, but just to preview it, we had to increase the simulations for the different inflation assumption. So we assumed 2.45 national inflation. SIB had 2.2 embedded in their simulations. So we adjusted for that. And then we decreased the returns for lower expected long-term private equity. And I'll elaborate on that here in a moment. So these are big adjustments. Want to spend a little bit more time on them. This just sort of recaps it too for disclosure. This is a sort of a text-heavy slide. My apologies. Inflation we really already talked about. They have a 15-year period. I think their assumption's reasonable for a 15-year period. I wasn't comfortable with that level of inflation for 50, 75 years. So we added 0.25% to the simulations to have consistent inflation assumptions so that our set of assumptions are consistent. And then private equity. I mentioned earlier that they think that over the next 15 years, private equity will earn 300 percentage points more than global equity. I think that's reasonable for a 15-year period, but not for 50 or 75. Like most asset classes, they evolve, they become more efficient, and in an asset class like private equity, that means that returns will be lower. There's also a lot more competition in private equity. Private equity 30 years ago was not private equity today. And I don't think the State Investment Board would disagree with that either. But to give you some data, so you're not just having to trust me without any background here, what has the premium of private equity to global equity actually looked like historically going back over the last 25 years? We are starting to see a decline in private equity returns relative to global equity. So this is just the difference between a private equity return and global equity return. So the last 25 years is about 4.5% or 450 basis points. Spiked up a little bit in the last 20 years, just over 500. Last 15 years, 400. Last 10 years, about 300. Last 5 years, about 100. I wouldn't put too much weight on the last 5 years. It's a pretty short period of time. But the trend here seems pretty undeniable. I think the evolution is playing out in this market. So instead of assuming 300% in perpetuity, we brought it down to 200, which is still, we don't know. It could be higher, it could be lower. So another pause here because we threw a lot of numbers at you. So I just wanted to pull out a few key numbers that can ground you on how do we get to 7.4. It's really a two-step process. Start with the median 50-year return from SIB that you saw earlier, 7.34. Average expected return per year over 50 years. The return's going to do this, but when you average it, that would be 7.34. Bump it up further inflation by 0.25, so we have consistent inflation assumptions and consistent with our other assumptions, we get to 7.59. Add on the lower private equity return, still put in inflation adjustment, you get to 7.36. That's how we get to 7.4. It's not quite as simple as a mathematical exercise like this, but really that is sort of the foundation for how we got to 7.4 and why we're recommending lowering the return from 7.5 to 7.4. Good news for your plan is it's not as big of an adjustment as the other plans that are at 7.7. So to recap the recommendation, this slide shows you the three assumptions, what they are currently, what the recommendation is. The first two are going down by the inflation assumption change, 3 to 275. Corresponding change to general salary growth going from 375 to 3.5. And then the investment return going from 7.5 to 7.4. It's not going down by the same 0.25 because of this inflation adjustment that's different, and the adjustment for private equity. It's sort of like a real rate of return adjustment. And just another reminder, please don't cherry pick. You might like some better than others, but it really is a set of assumptions. And before I hand it over to Mitch, I believe, to go over the budget impacts, do you have any questions about the analysis that I just presented?
By way of reminder, you are the only plan where your assumptions, these long-term economic assumptions, you adopt. You're not going to be adopting them today. And the actuary's office will be at future meetings when you will be considering adopting changes to these to answer questions. But maybe not all, perhaps all three of these same. So if you've got questions, even though you're not voting today, now's a good time to get as much as you can out of this presentation. It's a lot of numbers, but it's also a very key part of your responsibility to the plan.
Mike? Sorry. Steve?
Thanks. These are pretty big assumption changes in my perspective. How often do we make these assumption changes or adopt changes?
We formally look at them every 2 years, so that would be the cycle and the opportunity to make changes. How often they get changed in practice is probably less than that. And every year as an actuary, we have to attest to the fact that the assumptions are reasonable. So we're kind of doing this every time we look at them and certify your valuation. We don't formally recommend changes annually, though, unless it's really some significant change that's going on environmentally.
For this plan, the last time the actuary recommended changes was 6 years ago. That was when the change was recommended to lower the earnings assumption from 8 to 7.5. The board adopted that recommended change 6 years ago, and then the other plans, there was a phase-in from 8 to 7.9 to 7.8 to 7.7, and it kind of stalled there. I think that was 6 years ago. The actual recommendation might have been 7 years ago, or and then the board adopted it after that.
Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is this an immediate recommendation or for future biennia? I don't know if I'm jumping ahead here, but...
It's a really great question. I'm not sure Steve might be able to add to this if the Left 2 board follows a different process, but with the other plans, any changes would take effect in the 1921 biennium. And of course, we always give the legislature a chance to get in there and meddle. No. Revise.
Yeah, process-wise, for you, if you followed you would adopt the assumptions this year, and then the actuary would be able to incorporate those new assumptions into their next valuation report, which would then roll into the rate change for the 1921 biennium. That the board will be adopting rates for that biennium next year. As a practical matter, and we'll get more information for you and talk about that, phasing in or delaying those rate impacts when they're going up has been consistent practice. When rates are going down, then there's less need for employers to figure out how are they going to pay for it if it's going down. Good news is always recognized quicker than bad news, and so we'll give you a set of options at later meetings this interim in terms of how you want to manage the long-term, the rate impact of changing these assumptions.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The general salary growth, I think, I'm just wondering how that is calculated. Coming out of recession, I think some of the cities are actually reviewing the salary of some of our officers, and the actual salary is going up. Also, we're recruiting more people. So some of the entities that are frozen hiring during the recession are actually bringing more officers on board. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around the growth going down with those things happening.
It's a great question. I think before I get into some of the details, I'd say that the fundamental data that we're using here is actual retirement system data. So the historical part of it is actually looking at what's happening in PERS, TERS, SERS, LEF relative to inflation. And then we're just looking at the economic piece here. And then we also look at everything else, right? Everything else we would call demographic. So there's a lot of volatility that can happen in these assumptions. So I think we're seeing exactly what you're saying, and it's in the data, and I doubt that we're going to be able to nail the next 5 years of salary growth. Our goal is going to be over a longer term period that our assumptions are going to average out and approximate that growth that's going to happen over someone's career. Someone who might be, right now the market might be driving up salaries a little bit, but then things tend to stabilize. And then we also, a big part of this that we didn't talk about is we're constantly reviewing these and updating these assumptions. So I don't want to somehow claim that we have a crystal ball and we know that this is going to happen. If we're wrong, we're going to bring it to you as soon as we see it emerging. There's a little bit of speculation here and judgment without a doubt. And I think your question's great, and it sounds like you might be feeling it too, as someone who has to make a decision about should we make this change. Real quickly, there's some slides in the back that we're not going to go through, but I know one thing that boards have to deal with, maybe they don't talk about a lot, is peer risk. Like, what are our peers doing? We looked at this, and the National Association of State Retirement Administrators does an annual survey. Just got our hands on the latest survey. The median return, investment return assumption across that survey, which I think is like 126 plans, and the largest plans in the country, is 7.5. So pretty consistent with what we're seeing, and we're seeing a trend towards lower return assumptions. But because of that balancing act that Lisa mentioned, what I've noticed over my career is that changes occur slowly. And that probably the affordability arm wrestle wins out a little bit in the short term, and then there's a little bit of a reality going back the other direction. So, but I hope that helps in terms of context. 7.4 would not be an outlier relative to your peers, and maybe setting a trend for the future. I think Mitch is going to go over the budget impact, so thank you for letting me stand. It's great to be in a room where I'm not, you guys aren't in the dais and the room is small enough to actually look at you.
Okay, so as Matt said, I'm going to go through a little bit of the impact on contribution rates as well as some predicted budget impacts. So I just want a quick reminder is that inflation and general salary growth, the decrease in those two assumptions are going to be a savings, and obviously the decrease in the investment return assumptions is a cost. And for LEF 2 only, the savings actually outweighs the cost because the investment return assumption is only stepping down from 7.5 to 7.4. So here we have some estimated changes in contribution rates. So we've provided estimated changes in contribution rates for two different methods here. The aggregate method, that is the method that's in statute. So we wanted to make sure you saw what the change, estimated change in rates for the statutory funding method is. We've also provided an estimated rate change for 100% of the entry age normal rates, and that is the board's current policy. So last year, the board adopted contribution rates for 17-19 and 19-21 equal to 100% of the entry age normal rates. You will notice that the aggregate rate method has a larger savings, a larger rate reduction associated with it. I won't bore you with the actuarial specifics of why that is the case, but for today's purposes, it's probably best to just focus on that change in the 100% entry age normal method column. So, and as a reminder, the rates that the board adopted last interim were 8.75% for employees, 5.25% for employers, and 3.5% for the state. This slide and the next has some estimated budget impacts. We've given the budget impacts for LEF as well as the other state retirement systems. We thought you might be interested in how they are potentially reacting to the adoption of these economic assumptions as well. You will notice that LEF is the only one with a negative budget impact, which denotes a savings, while positive numbers denotes a cost. Very important as well, the savings for LEF on this slide and the next are based off that aggregate rate change, so not the entry age rate change. So if we were to base these budget impacts off that entry age rate change, it'd be about 40% of the savings that you see here. And then this slide is for the next biennium, the 21-23 biennium.
One other quick thing, I just wanted to add that we used this chart for an earlier presentation of the Select Committee. When we present to the Pension Funding Council, we're going to show the impact sort of with and without the LEF 2 numbers, because we don't want to jump the gun here. Obviously, we know it's your decision. We don't want to assume that anything is going to be adopted. So we'll show the Pension Funding Council the impact with and without that change and highlight that for them, because that really is their purview, everything but LEF 2.
All right, thank you, Matt. And in terms of next steps, I think Matt kind of already covered it, but you guys have the authority to adopt the recommendations for economic assumptions, and they are subject to revision by the legislature. And then also, as Matt said, in the appendix, we have other states' economic assumptions. We've also provided the contribution rate impact for the other systems as well, if you want to see how your contribution rate impact compares to theirs. And with that, I think that concludes our presentation, and we are open to take any additional questions.
Questions? I've got a really dumb one. So you went through the presentation and you talked about where you are kind of right now looking at the long-term growth, right? And that's present day. How does that line up with what your proposals are as far as your recommendations? I mean, if you make a recommendation and we adopt it, what does that do to our,
So that's a great question. If you recall the risk management bubbles, one of them is adopting reasonable assumptions because they lead to reasonable funding. These are what our recommendations are for reasonable assumptions. And really what happens, the health of the plans in the future really depend on what actually happens, right? So if we can get the assumptions as close to what actually happens, then the health will be in a better position.
And maybe a sub-part of that is those projections use current assumptions, so we didn't assume adoption of the assumptions in those future outlooks. If you do adopt the assumptions at a subsequent board meeting, we can update how the projected funded status for the program might change, for example. Because, it will have impacts, but I agree with Lisa. It's all about timing, right? The assumptions don't determine the ultimate cost of a pension plan. Ultimately, the actual salaries are going to surface, actual investment returns are going to surface. So the closer we are to the actual experience, the less expensive these plans will be.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at slides 44, 45, and then kind of jumping ahead to your appendix 48, I was kind of curious if it'd be possible to get a comparative chart to see if the other pension plans had adopted your original recommendation of dropping from 8 to 7.5 instead of stair-stepping it down to 7.7. Just kind of see a comparison there.
I will say one of the things, maybe not that specific piece of information, Mike, but one of the things that we will be doing at the October meeting, since we've got a number of new board members who weren't here when the board created and discussed their funding method, the one that you're currently using, we're going to go over that so that all of you understand sort of the place where you're coming from, because it's completely natural to look at why are rates in all the other plans going up and rates in LEP 2 are staying steady. Why is Teachers Plan 2 funded at one percentage and LEP Plan 2 funded at a different percentage if they're both invested by the State Investment Board and they're both administered by DRS? Where do these differences emerge? And in your case, it's all good news because they've been positive differences, as the actuaries just showed in their presentation. You're the only plan that's going to have the benefit of saying, wow, if we adopt the actuaries' new assumptions, we actually lower costs. That's extraordinary. Why? How did that happen? That's what we'll be talking about in October. Not so much to go back and kind of second guess what was done for the other plans, but to help you understand maybe some of the benefits of the decisions that the board has made in the past for this plan, because you're going to be continually making these decisions, and if past practice in terms of it plays out, historically, the legislature will second guess whatever decisions that you make. They may not change the decisions that you make, but they will certainly call stakeholder groups and Steve in to explain what the decisions that you were made and couldn't you have made even more optimistic decisions that would help our budget situation? Those kind of things happen all the time. This type of information, though, is really helpful. Now that the board's current policy has been in place for 10 plus years, you've actually got now some historical data to show solvency, affordability. Here's how the board has managed rate volatility, unlike the other plans. And here's the results now from 10 plus years of doing it this way in terms of funded status, in terms of rate stability. So now you can actually, instead of having a theoretical discussion about we think this change will improve rate stability, you can show how it has. We'll talk about all of that, though, in more detail in October as part of getting the new board all on the same page. There's a lot of new board members.
If I may follow up on that. Yes, we could. Mathematically, we could, if I understand your request. Like let's recast history, and had you made these contributions consistent with those assumptions, where would we be now? Yes, but professionally, I'd respectfully ask to decline because of so many assumptions that we have to make in order to do that work. And you really can't change history. And even though it seems simple, just recalculate the contribution rates, assume that everybody makes their contributions, assume that the ensuing stream of contributions, is funded as well. There's no benefit improvements, right? Nothing changes. The list of disclosures that I have to provide is so long. I wonder if it would be decision useful. But I totally understand. I really wish it were that simple because I think that would be a very interesting data point.
Gotcha. And I think my question was it possible? And it doesn't sound like it's reasonable. So, yeah, thanks. I don't need that information now.
Thanks. I saw there was a difference. Maybe you explained it. I just wasn't quite catching it. But between the 7.4% that you would recommend assuming versus the 7.36% number, what's the difference between those two numbers? And can you explain that maybe?
Yeah, that slide. If we jump back to that one right there. Yeah, so that was just trying to provide some context. I think if I remember, I said it's not just a simple mathematical exercise. So I don't feel comfortable setting an assumption with that much implied precision. That 7.36. So what typically we're going to do is just round one way or the other. In this case, I felt comfortable with 7.4 as opposed to 7.35, given all the uncertainties. But yeah, it's not quite as simple as just adding up all those numbers and getting your recommendation. There's judgment involved. 7.35 is a reasonable assumption. So 7.4. And I think other people would argue that 7.5 is a reasonable assumption. I've had, when I presented this to the select committee, one member said, I think we should be at 7, and that our expectations are too high. It's not an easy exercise.
So the way I read your number came in at 7.36, and you kind of decided that 7.4 would be a reasonable assumption. Okay?
Except I would push back that we don't turn it into a math exercise. This is just how can I get comfortable with 7.4 and show you something that supports 7.4 without it actually being a formula, because we don't approach it as a formula. Does that help?
Any other questions? All right. Steve, you got anything to follow?
No, Mr. Chair, I understand that lunch is available, so if you wanted to take a break and get your lunch, and then you come back here and typically then I'll do the admin update while you guys are eating so that you can keep the meeting moving. But you want to take...
Yeah. Without objection, we'll take a very short recess to get our food and come back and get some more work done. Are you ready? I think we're all back. We'll go ahead and get started with our second half. Mr. Nelson.
All right. This is actually item number 8 on the agenda, so we're still kind of shuffling around. For the newer board members, part of what we do is while you guys are eating, I give the admin update, and so that the meeting can kind of keep flowing and end sooner. And you guys are on schedule or slightly ahead of schedule, which is good right now. We want to keep it that way. So the admin update will be fairly brief. I want to make sure it's long enough that Ryan has a chance to eat, because he'll be up next with his presentation on benefit improvement pricing. But for purposes of the admin update, reminder, October is the strategic planning meeting, and that meeting is actually going to be outside of the SIB as well. One of the reasons why we're here today is they're remodeling at the State Investment Board building, and that includes the board room. So for October, our meeting will be off-site again, but it'll be downtown. I don't want to say it too loud, but we'll be at the DoubleTree. We won't be here. We'll make sure that that's in all the materials and stuff that go out to you. A couple of other items then. Outreach. I attended the WACOPS conference recently and gave a presentation on the issues that are on the board's agenda for the interim. As I mentioned, I also spoke last week or earlier this week, it's all kind of blurring together, to the Select Committee on Pension Policy about what you're working on this interim. They want me to come back and kind of touch bases with them again on issues that the board is working on. I'll probably be talking to them for one reason or another at every meeting for the rest of the year. So they'll keep apprised of what you're doing. What they decide to do with that, I don't know yet. I don't know if they'll partner with you on the military service recommendation or not. One other item, though, about partnering, the Department of Retirement Systems. That we continue to work with them on the new rules for duty-related disabilities, and we're fairly close. I am confident that those rules will be done before the start of session, and we met and talked about some other rules after that one that we'll continue working on probably into next interim. I'll keep you apprised of those and the status of those as it goes on. But that's been a very cooperative process. Historically, the department will adopt rules, and maybe they'll send out a notice to us by email saying, hey, we're about to adopt a rule, what's your input? And that might have been it. This is completely different. So they set up a project team to manage this rule. They knew it was focused on Left 2. They invited me and Ryan to attend all the project team meetings. They've allowed us to provide draft language at times, and they've considered it. They've solicited our input on their draft language. So it has been a genuinely cooperative process. And again, final product, I think we're still on track to have that done by the end of the year. In addition to the presentation to WACOPS, and typically the board will have presentations about what you're doing to other major stakeholder conferences. The fire commissioners are coming up with firefighters were a while back. Also, local groups have now started to reach out to us, and so particularly the firefighters have these regional, what they're calling financial wellness seminars. It's a day-long thing, and it'll involve all different aspects of a member's financial health, their medical, but retirement is part of that. And we've been asked to attend those to answer questions about Left 2, how that fits in, and then specific regional questions come up. There was one of those seminar of those just recently out in Spokane Valley, and Paul Neal attended that one. And there's another one coming up next week, I think, in Seattle, and we'll have a Left 2 representative at that meeting as well. Final item I want to mention, the Retired Firefighters of Washington brought extra copies of their newsletter. It primarily applies to Left 1, but they've got Left 2 members as well. They brought extra copies of the newsletter for all of you, and we've got those available in the back, so you want to make sure you get that before you leave today. With that concludes my administrative update for today, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Jason.
Go, Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the wellness seminars that you were attending, does that include the ombudsman presentation, or is that a separate?
Usually that's separate. Sometimes, depending on what the particular organization requests, sometimes they'll say, or Tammy, they'll just have a separate piece on disability only, and that's usually the ombudsman. If they want general information only, then usually it's somebody else other than the ombudsman. And so it depends on what they ask for. But if they ask for the ombudsman, then usually we'll have Tammy go as well. She's done several presentations that I've mentioned in the past on her own for groups that wanted ombudsman only.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Steve? How's Ryan doing? All ready? All right. Want to bring Ryan back up for the next one?
Yeah. So, by way of introduction, as Ryan comes up, when the board was first formed, there was a lot of what I would call member interest in improving benefits. That they had been making requests of the legislature for a number of years about one benefit or another, and the only way that existed at that time to figure out how much it cost would be to get a legislator to write a bill or introduce a bill, and then to get the actuary to do a fiscal note on that bill. And that was sort of that was not a very member-friendly process for figuring out the price of these, and it often led to a lot of misunderstanding or lack of information about the true cost of some of the proposals that were being discussed. What the board did early on was identify a lot or all of those what I would call frequently requested benefit improvements and the variations thereof, and then systematically set about working with the actuary to get those priced. And so I think Mark is probably the only one that was around back in 2015, but there was presentations by the actuary literally every month, and they would pick a different benefit each month and different options of that. We're revisiting that. Now that's 12 years old, and so we're starting to get some of the same questions from members about what would it cost for a 3% multiplier? Why don't we have that yet? Those types of questions, when they come up, now the data, the answer to that question is 12 years old. Investment assumptions have changed. Demographic assumptions have changed. A lot has changed in 12 years, and so the board felt it was time to kind of modernize or update that pricing exercise. This is the first piece of that. And for the first piece, we took the most popular benefit improvement request, which is an increase in the multiplier. We didn't go through all the different versions, but this is today Ryan's going to talk to you a little bit about one option, and then as time permits later on in the interim and actuarial resources permit later on in the interim, we'll hit the plan is to have another presentation on a different benefit in November and a different one in December, and then we'll revisit it next year leading into the interim to see how much further you guys want to continue to go down as far as modernizing the prices. With that, I will turn it over to Ryan to talk to you about this particular pricing result.
Thanks, Steve. Mr. Chair, members of the board, for the record, Ryan Frost, board staff. And as Steve mentioned, one of the goals of this board strategic plan is to keep the stakeholders informed, and one of the ways of meeting that goal is for the board to be briefed on the price of certain benefit improvements. There's no action required on this today. We're not asking you a yes or no vote on this multiplier moving forward. This is just an educational for your information. So as Steve mentioned, it's been 12 years since the board has requested pricing on benefit improvements, and this briefing will be on one in particular, the multiplier. Current multiplier used in LEF 2 is 2%, and a change to that existing multiplier could impact all active members in the plan. Board staff requested the state actuary's office to price two specific multiplier increases, a 2.5% multiplier on all service and a 2.5% multiplier on prospective service only. And to go back a little bit to that 2005 pricing, there was, as Steve mentioned, there's a number of different multiplier options that were reviewed, and they range from an increase of 2.25 or to 3%. And the actuary's estimated cost for that 2.25 multiplier in that following biennium would have been $111 million, and for 3% it would have been $444 million, and for their 2.5% multiplier they estimated to be a $222 million cost. And to get to their findings for the 2017 multiplier pricing, all service would see a total rate increase of 12.34%, half of that bore by the members, 30% by the employer, and 20% by the state. I gave an example of what the contribution rates would be if that benefit was adopted on the right. Impact on the contribution rates for prospective service only, a 2.5% multiplier would be a 4.88 total rate increase, again, half that bore by the members, 30% by the employer, 20% by the state, and contributions rates, if that benefit was approved, are also on the right. As far as budget impacts, for all service for 18-19, we're looking at just over $106 million, and a 25-year cost just under $3.2 billion. 2.5% for prospective service only, looking at the next 18-19 cost of $42 million, a 25-year cost just shy of $2 billion. And our funded status, according to the last valuation, if this benefit was to be approved today, would drop from 105 to 90 for all service, and from 105 to 100 for prospective service only. So that's the results of their first pricing. If you have any actuarial questions, I would ask one of the actuaries to come up and be able to answer those. If you have any policy questions about it, I'd be happy to answer those. But I'll open up for questions, and I can scroll between these two.
All right, Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan, can you remind me or remind us, what is there a cap on what our contributions can be?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
I guess I'm a little confused on the difference between all service and prospective service.
Right. So all service would go back to any active members from their first day of service forward would be calculated.
Yeah.
Only for actives.
Yeah, so that's a good point, and it's important to understand it because you'll be getting the same type of piece in the future present benefits as well. Usually when these benefit improvements are asked for, different people have different ideas, and so, for instance, usually what they're talking about is applying it to all service. So you'll get somebody who's close to retirement. They've got 20 years in, and they're getting ready to retire, and they want the multiplier increase, but they want it to apply not just to the next year or two before they retire, but they want it to apply to the 20 years that they've already worked. So that's that all-service cost. We want to make sure that's usually the type of request, whether it's phrased exactly this way or not, that members are talking about. But at the same time, then sometimes there are, well, if we can't do that, and even though it's not going to impact me, what could we do for the next generation or the young guys for their, and that's usually then what they're talking about is prospective service only. Service, that the rest of their service stays at the 2% multiplier, but the next year they would get 2.5 for that. That's kind of how that breakdown is between all service and prospective. It doesn't apply to retirees. So there's nothing in here that says you're going to go in to all the guys who already retired with a 2% multiplier and now give them 2.5 and increase their pensions. That is not included in this pricing. And there's all kinds of variations on this. A variation that the board focused on the last time this was priced was what is kind of a tiered multiplier. For instance, under the prospective, a brand new guy who's hired tomorrow, he's going to get 2.5% for the first year. What if you really only want to do this for career employees? You don't want to provide a 2.5% multiplier to somebody who's new who might leave in 5 years. You only want to provide it to people who've worked a career. Those types of discussions that the board had 12 years ago, that type of tiered idea will be the next iteration of the pricing exercise that you get in November, is an idea of could you reduce the costs by only increasing the multiplier for career employees. I don't want to, spoiler alert, but that's what you'll see in November. What we'll do too is we'll go back and we when I'm saying this, it'll be Ryan and me, to make sure that we did get a 2.5% multiplier number from the actuary 12 years ago. So we'll compare that rate impact and that budget impact, but mainly the rate impact between the old number and the new number, so that we'll be able to explain why it's higher. I'm pretty sure it's going to be higher because the investment return assumption has been lowered since then, and the expectancy for how long members are going to live has increased since then. Both of those drive up the cost. So a lot of the people who were like, well, that number's 12 years old. Do you have a newer number? I think they were hoping it would be better news. But
I can give you that number now if you want.
Yeah. What? How has it?
Before the 2.5%, all service was an 8.8% increase.
And now it's at
12.34.
So that gives you an idea of how much the costs have gone up in the last 10 years as a result of the assumption changes. Representative Berquist?
Thanks. You were mentioning the career number. Yeah. Would that mean like from year 20 to year 30 it's 2.5, or are you saying once you hit year 10 you now are at 2.5 all the way through?
Yeah, the specific that we looked at a number of different options, and I think the specific option that you're going to see in November is that for your first 15 years you still get 2%, and that beginning with the 16th year on, you get a multiplier increase to 3. What that would do is get you to 60% at 25 years of service or something like that, which was something the board specifically talked about. A lot of financial planning experts say if you can get 60% of your income in retirement, that's a goal. And with a 2% multiplier, it's hard to get there because most Left 2 members don't work 30 years. So was there a way to get to 60% at 25 years? That was roughly how it all came up. Now, all of this type of stuff we're going to be talking about in October so that you'll understand historically where the board, how this pricing exercise fed into the, as Ryan mentioned, the goal of keeping the members informed, and how this, we don't want to create any unreasonable expectation, for instance, because it did happen. I had somebody call me up just literally a day after you guys voted to have the pricing exercise for this meeting saying, I was just told that the board voted to increase the multiplier. And it's like, no, they did not vote to do that. But it's an example of how this is an issue of intense interest to members, particularly members who are about ready to retire and are hoping that they might get a windfall before they retire in the form of a all-service multiplier increase. What I've been telling them is no, the board is getting the pricing information to actually help manage those types of unreasonable expectations that, no, you can't expect to have a multiplier increase in the next 6 months if you're thinking about retiring in the next 6 months, because it's going to more than double the Left 2 contribution rate and more than double the Left 2 costs, and there's no expectation that that's going to happen. I get to be the unfortunate bearer of that type of bad news at these, like WACOPS or State Council of Firefighter conferences when those questions come up. But it is part of the strategic plan that the board, that you adopted, and that is part of my job description. So that's how it plays out. Thank you for having that historical comparison already handy. Anticipating right where my brain was going.
Took 5
You're
years,
good?
but I'm getting there.
You're good.
So you're saying 3% is out of the equation?
Just kidding.
All right. Any questions for Ryan on this? All right. Moving on. Looks like we have. You want Ryan to finish up because he's got number 11, or do you want to take a break? Or to move on?
You want to jump right?
I can. Just let me grab my.
Yep. All right. So in the today's practice of totally shuffling up the agenda, we will move item number 11 ahead of item number 10, and we'll have Ryan do the presentation on disabled members returning to work. By brief introduction, this was one of a couple of issues that came out of working with DRS on the duty disability rulemaking project as an issue that they were hoping that policymakers would take attention to. We brought it to your attention at the July meeting, and you asked for this initial consideration. With that, I'll turn it over to Ryan. Jason?
Sorry, I was trying to
get
get before we started this next one. On the last one, Mr. Chair, is there anything in the way of a handout on Ryan's prior presentation on the multipliers that would be available?
There's a report. The report behind it's a 2-pager. I try to keep it short so it could be printed.
Right. That's really what I need.
Yeah.
So I can use that.
Yeah, we'll put something on that. What we did 12 years ago was once we had done all the improvement pricing, we had a 1-pager that had everything on it. But that might take 3 months before we get all that. So we can come up with an easy 1-pager for board members to hand to their member. If you're getting hit back home, when am I going to get that 2% multiplier? Or a 2.5, you will have something for you.
A handout would take a lot of heat off and be much appreciated.
That's our job. Okay. So we can do that.
The second page of that report is actually all the charts that the actuaries did and sent to us, which was half the presentation. It just has all those on one page. So we can definitely. I
would like to have a handout that just says no. But
yeah.
If you've ever dealt with cops, it's usually not an option. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ade? Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just like to challenge us a little bit to think outside the box. And I'll just throw this out for future discussion. What about if there's a benefit for the law enforcement officers to serve longer? What about for it to go to 2.25 or 2.5 after 20 years? Knowing full well both the state and the entities, I mean, let's get real, cannot afford anything now. But just hypothetically, if we were to see the cost, say, well, if you've been in the system for 20 years and the 21st, you go to 2.25 or whatever, how much would that be? And if there's a benefit for us, for officers, to serve longer?
That's a great question, and that's the exact same place that this initial presentation led 12 years ago with the board. It led to that type of thing. This doesn't work. So what could work? And the tiered multiplier, which is what you're talking about as an option of a tiered multiplier, we'll be talking about in November. It won't be that specific option that you just mentioned, but we'll give you an idea of, it'll give you an idea of how much kind of tiering the multiplier can adjust that cost. And then I think back in 2012, the board ended up looking at like 8 different types of tiered multipliers, different variations on it. And so that'll be where we'll come back to you down the road is, now that we've got through this, do you want to dig into some of these options a little bit further to see how the cost would change? We can certainly do that. And again, you're anticipating the exact, for Mark, some of this stuff will be like deja vu all over again, but because he went through the first pricing exercise and all these discussions, but that's this is a perfect example of how the board has changed over 12 years. The personality of the board has changed. All of the discussion about benefit improvements went away during the Great Recession. But that was 5 years ago. It's almost like it never happened. So, yeah, for some members now or members who might have only been hired after that, that's the constant evolution of this that we try to stay on top of on behalf of you guys. Now, with that, I think if there are no other questions on the multiplier issue, you ready to roll?
Yeah. Again, for the record, Ryan Frost, board staff. And as Steve mentioned, this is disabled members return to work. And the issue, if you remember, is members who recover from their disabilities are stuck in a sort of limbo if their previous employer refuses to hire them back. As Steve mentioned, this was an issue that we basically found out about from our discussions with DRS. And it's a technical fix, but there's a lot of policy questions behind it. So current disability statute says when a member is determined to have recovered from their disability, the member's previous employer is required to hire them back at their previous rank. Now, a couple issues can arise because the employer may disagree with DRS's decision that the member has fully recovered from their disability, so they won't hire them back on the job. And this leaves a member in limbo pending the appeals decision, and they're in limbo for 2 reasons. First, because of disability payments stopped from DRS. A member who receives disability allowance is subject to comprehensive medical examinations as required, and if DRS looks at those medical examinations and sees that the member has recovered from their incapacitating disability, they're no longer entitled to benefits under Title 51 RCW, so the member's disability retirement allowance is therefore canceled, and they are restored to duty. And then, as I mentioned, with their previous employer, once the determination has been made that the member has recovered from their disability, the member's previous employer is required to hire them back at the same civil service rank they held at the time of their disability retirement. The relevant RCW for that is 4126-470, Section 2. As I mentioned, though, the employers do have the option to appeal that decision, which leaves the member, 1, not getting their disability check, and 2, not having a salary. And we're aware of one current case where this is happening, and DRS has actually chosen to continue paying the member's disability benefit while the appeal works its way through the process. And once the appeal works its way through and let's say DRS is given a favorable decision, that member will return to their left eligible position and again begin earning service credit and become eligible for an active member benefit when they retire. So, as I mentioned, there's a couple sticky policy issues behind it. The first is, should DRS continue to pay a disability benefit to members who are no longer disabled? This is kind of an in-house policy that they're taking right now with this one member. Should this policy be in statute and something they should be following for any future member who this happens to. And then there's a second issue is what should they be able to bill the employer for the disability payments they're making to the member while they're stuck in the limbo during the appeals process? And then if they don't bill the employer, where does that money come from? So that concludes the basic background of what's going on right now. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Brian, can you go back to
Yeah.
Can you go back to the previous? Yeah. That question, it says, should DRS continue to pay a disability benefit to a member who are no longer disabled? Now, is that...
So basically it means that the determination has been made that this member is no longer disabled, but DRS has saw that the employer is appealing that decision, so they're not getting the disability check anymore, but they're also not hired in active duty. Right. So DRS made the decision that, okay, we're just going to continue this guy's disability payments then, even though we know he's not disabled, but we're going to continue paying him while it works through the appeal.
Yeah. See, the fine issue here, if you want to dig into it, is who determines that the member is no longer disabled. All of the pension statutes are written based on the department making that determination. And so as soon as DRS says the member is no longer disabled, all the pension statutes are set to say,
he shall
turn off. If he's not disabled, he doesn't get a disability benefit, or they don't get a disability benefit. Now, as a practical matter, in this one instance, there's actually two parties trying to decide whether the member is disabled, the department and the original employer. And they may have a differing opinion about whether or not the member's returned. And that differing opinion, it could be legitimate. In other words, different doctors say yes and say no, and DRS says on weight, we think yes, and the employer says on weight, we say no. But there's also the possibility that the employer doesn't want that person back. And then maybe they might actually think that they're recovered, but they don't really want them back, and so they're going to appeal that decision and delay the application of that statute that says they have to take them back as long as possible. So that kind of pointed out there is a I don't want to call it a loophole, but there's this area in statute where the member can get caught in limbo, whether it's good faith disagreement about whether they've recovered from disability or not, or whether it's just simply the employer doesn't want to follow the statute that says they have to take them back, and they want to use this appeal process to delay that as long as possible. The question, though, has come up, if DRS feels that they're recovered, what do they do in that situation? And then to the extent that it's determined later on that, no, they really were recovered, and the employer has to take them back after the appeal process, who pays for that? Because the way it's set up now, that becomes a fund cost. All the other members and the employers and the state are essentially paying for those disability retirement payments that were made to the member during that appeal process. That's kind of fine-tuning those policy questions. And again, you're not being asked to vote on those today, but the next step would be to bring this back to you in November with a little bit more information about options that would be available to you to address one or both of those policy questions.
Steve, could I just ask a question? From the audience, can I ask a question?
What's your practice?
No.
I'll get that.
I just wanted to ask, who makes that determination? Does the board have
No,
the member examined?
No, it's not the Left 2 board. It's the Department of Retirement Systems and the employer.
So the Department of Retirement Systems can have them examined?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jason?
It just as a matter of order, we usually save public comments for the end.
Yes. But I will also say, as a matter of practice, you guys have done everything over the past, over the past 12 years. There's been times when you've taken questions from the audience during a presentation, and times where you've said, "Listen, we don't have enough time for that right now, and we'll answer your questions, or Steve will answer your questions after the meeting." However you guys want to handle that is, you've done it both ways, usually depending on how much time you have available.
Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve Ryan, couple questions. First is there an allowance for the employee to waive their right to be hired back for, say, like a settlement or something along those lines?
They don't necessarily waive it. If they don't want to be rehired back, they just don't do it. And a lot of times, that's exactly what ends up happening if there's an appeal by the employer. For whatever reason, the employer doesn't want them back. They either don't think that they're recovered, or they just don't want them back for some other reason. They go into appeal, and then part of the settlement of that appeal is you're not coming back, and we'll pay you whatever, 6 months of, who knows. But part of that appeal is you're not coming back. For the most part, though, and as a practical matter, they tend to be situations where the member legitimately has recovered and they want back. And you guys know, right now there's a shortage of qualified firefighters and qualified law enforcement officers. And so if you are qualified and you want to come back to work, for the most part, the employers are looking to take them back. It just tends to be some of these outlier cases where this issue comes up. And a lot of times employers simply aren't aware of that statute. I can't tell you how many times I've been on the phone with an employer and said, "You need to take a look at RCW 4126-470 sub 2, where it says you have to take them back." And they're like, "Oh, I was not aware of that statute. Now that I am, I wish I hadn't asked." That kind of thing comes up surprisingly at least a couple of times every year.
My second question is, has DRS expressed any interest as far as pursuing this as agency request legislation, or what's their timeline for drafting up?
No, it's not going to be agency request legislation. This was, and I won't say it's a DRS request, this was just an issue that was identified during the rulemaking process that we thought we'd bring to your attention because it's sort of put DRS jammed up. I think the deadline for agency request legislation is already passed. Usually that's the end of August. At least last time I worked for DRS, that was it. You had to have stuff in to the governor's office before the end of August.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. In regards to these two questions, obviously for future deliberation, is this going to require like bill language to change or something else?
Yeah, both of these DRS issues were issues that in talking to them, doing the rulemaking process with them, it was kind of determined rulemaking can't fix this. And partly because that statute 470(2) says if you're recovered from your disability, shall stop your payments. Doesn't say, now where DRS has had the legitimate wiggle room here is recovered from disability. They're willing to look at this and say, well, as long as it's an appeal about whether or not, then we'll kind of set our initial determination aside. Maybe a court will determine that we were wrong, and so we'll act as if it's still an unresolved question. And legally, I think they're okay doing that, but it definitely is a question, and it raises the question of, even if they're okay doing that, who's paying? And that's where the policy question kind of comes in terms of, do you guys feel like this is something you want to change or not?
Well, and the next person at DRS making that decision might not have the same.
Might,
Right.
yeah.
I see the biggest issue is obviously the second point, and you just brought that up, is who's going to pay.
Right.
So that's where we're going to need bill language.
Yeah. So the process on this, just so I understand it, so if you had an injury, person gets, breaks a leg, whatever, really bad, they go off, they go through their time lost, L&I, they separate employment, they're now on disability retirement, so to speak.
Yep.
And they become, to a point, fixed and stable, able to attain work based upon DRS's doctor, and then you have the question that comes up. Does L&I at any point reevaluate? Do they play into this part as far as an evaluation period again, as far as whether or not they can come back? Because they've obviously had some vested interest as well.
L&I comes into the process in two ways. One, like you mentioned, the breaking of the leg. This statute only applies to duty-related injuries. So if you break your leg skiing, your employer doesn't have to take you back, even if you recover. But if you have a duty-related injury, which is determined by L&I, then they have to take you back. If you've recovered, and it specifically says in statute, your eligibility for any benefits under Title 51 ends as well. So that's an L&I determination under Title 51. So they would say, oh, you're recovered. It's not just fixed and stable. That could be certainly part of it. But you're done. You know, you're done getting anything for this particular injury.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd motion that we move this to the next step.
And your motion to move to the next step being, just so...
What that means is we would do a follow-up presentation to this, and it would be at the November meeting. Yeah.
A motion's been made and seconded to move this issue to our November meeting with further information. It's been made and seconded. Discussion. Go ahead, Mark.
So I have a question then in terms of the discussion. Is what gives the employer the ability to file an appeal? Is that another statutory right that the employer has, or do they just say, I'm not going to take them back?
Any determination of the department is subject to appeal. That's just part of the Administrative Appeals Act. So,
okay. So it wouldn't be... Okay.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Seeing none, abstaining? Seeing none, motion passes.
all right. Thank you, Ryan. Now I think we're actually we're back on the agenda. Item number 11, disabled members. Oh, nope. No, take that back. So we're on item number 10, catastrophic disability medical insurance. And we're a little bit ahead of schedule so far on the agenda, which is good. But so Paul, don't change that.
I get to talk more then?
This is another issue that came up in the discussions with the Department of Retirement Systems. And so we brought it to your attention at the July meeting, and you asked to put it on the work plan for this agenda. This is the initial time, though, that you've heard this issue. With that, I will turn it over to Paul to talk about it a little bit more.
Okay, I'm going to take a page from Matt's book and stand up just because I'm the last guy speaking, and so I'm going to use what I can. This is, again, talking about the benefit the catastrophic retirees get. Right now, there's catastrophic retirees, and that's people who are so disabled that they cannot earn gainful employment, which right now I think is $1,200 a month. In addition to the catastrophic benefit, they get their health care premiums reimbursed, and that's for the spouse and the retiree. That breaks down into two categories. Before Medicare eligibility, which is pre-65, they get a reimbursement for the health insurance premiums up to the COBRA amount. And, of course, the COBRA is the amount that the employer provides when an employee separates, or the ability for the employee to still participate in the employer's risk pool. Then after they hit Medicare eligibility, it turns into a reimbursement of Medicare premiums, Part A, which usually is not a thing, because if you've got Medicare either from your left employment or from other employment, there won't be any Part A cost. And then Part B,
which is right now $134 a month. They're not or the catastrophic retirees and their spouses are not eligible for reimbursement of the Part C and D premiums. Just to give you an idea what that looks like in the pre-Medicare terms, this is kind of rough. This is using employee and spouse, the average quote-unquote left retiree, age 56, with about a $60,000 a year benefit. The COBRA is about $1,158. The PEB, which is the Public Employees Benefit Board, and I'll explain more about what that means in a little bit for those of you that aren't familiar with that. And then the Health Exchange Plan Premium. This is an average of, I tried to find plans on the Health Exchange that were close to what you would get through PEB. These are not quite as good, but they're fairly close. The cost, as you see, is significantly higher. And I just heard in the car on the way to work today that the Health Exchange premiums are going up 24% this year. So that number is going to look more like $1,950. Part B reimbursement for Medicare, that's $134 a month. So once you hit Medicare, that coverage kicks in, and the obligation of the trust fund for premium reimbursement goes down significantly. The other piece here, the first piece we talked about is the catastrophic retirees and their survivors. This is about survivors of people who have line of death duty. There's a two-step process how this law came into being. In 2001, survivors of left two members killed in the line of duty were allowed to participate in PEB, but they still had to pay their own premiums. Then in 2006, a board bill said the left would reimburse the premiums for those people. The participation in PEB system, and again, PEB is basically just the risk pool of all state employees and a lot of different public employees. There's two different subsidies, if you will. There's the implicit subsidy, which is that you're in the same rate pool as everybody else, which includes those folks in their 20s who are working. And the explicit subsidy is once you hit Medicare eligibility, PEB pays your Medicare Part B premiums. So the first one is participating in the pool. The second one is actual cash out of pocket that PEB pays. So the board looked at extending the benefit to catastrophic retirees that death in line of duty survivors had. And in 2008, the board talked about it, came up with a proposal. Version 1 of that proposal, I think, was basically following the same trajectory as the benefit as it was approved for the death in service survivors. First part of the proposal was let them participate in PEB and pay their own premiums, and that was in 2009. The Healthcare Authority came out with a pretty hefty fiscal note with that, based on some different assumptions. The estimated costs were $1.5 million the first biennium, up to almost $5 million for the 2013-15 biennium. And you probably know that when you're talking about a bill, if you get over $1 million for a fiscal note, it goes to a higher level of scrutiny, which this bill wasn't able to withstand. Now, part of the reason for that was the catastrophic benefit was still fairly new then. There was no experience study to figure out how many of these people there actually were going to be. So it was kind of a best guess, and it turns out that may have been a little high. So version 2 comes back in 2010, which is what we have now. Version 2 is there's no PEB membership, so no HCA costs, and there's no PEB membership, but people get their insurance on the private market, and then the Left 2 fund reimburses them up to the COBRA amount, which is what we have now. The actuary did not recommend a supplemental rate increase, so there was a big shift in cost perception or cost projection between the 2009 bill, where they said this is going to have a lot of people, it's going to cost a lot of money. Excuse me. And then in 2010, it becomes, well, we can do this without any kind of supplemental rate increase. Now, it's a little bit apples and oranges because the HCA fiscal note was general fund cost, and the actuary fiscal note was contribution rate impact. But a big thing that changed between 2009 and 2010 is that an experience study came in. And so the actuary's office had some solid data that said, we're seeing that we're actually getting about 5.5 of these folks a year, as opposed to the 14 that the Healthcare Authority was assuming. And part of the actuary's earlier sensitivity analysis had been that, I don't know if you know what the sensitivity analysis that the actuary's office does in their fiscal notes is, as they were talking about earlier, we have these assumptions. You know, if they're assumptions, if they're wrong, you know, if they're off, you know, get some idea what the sensitivity is. So they had in the fiscal note, they said, well, if we're off on the number of people doing this by half, the costs are going to drop pretty much in half. It's not quite 1-to-1, but very sensitive to the number of retirees. So with that in mind, we can look at, if you were to go back and look at that original proposal of bringing these folks into PEB, there'd be some cost mitigation from the original Healthcare Authority fiscal note, which is your assumed rate. HCA assumed 14 a year. It was a little confusing because their narrative said 16 and their numbers said 14, so I'm going with 14. The current experience study rate, there's been another experience study that's come in since then where the actuaries are saying, well, based on what we've now got, I think it was 8 years of experience in the latest experience study, they're saying it's like more like 4.5 a year. So there's about 52 of these folks out here at this time. So given that statement in the sensitivity analysis, you would expect the costs to be significantly lower since your number of people doing it are significantly lower. Now, how much that would be, we don't really know yet. We're not at that point yet. The other cost mitigation potential from the initial costing is mortality, which is basically how long is the benefit expected to last, because these are lifetime benefits, so the longer the lifetime is expected to be, the more the benefits are going to cost. There's at least 3 different options. One is just general membership mortality. What do we expect the average left member to live? That's both healthy and disabled. That's going to be the longer number. The number that the Healthcare Authority used was disabled mortality, which is the average life expectancy for disabled individuals, which is obviously going to be a little less. And then there's a third one, which is Social Security disabled mortality. And that's relevant because the standard that is in the left to a catastrophic disability statute is the same as the Social Security standard. So that would give you a pretty good look at what can we expect for mortality for this particular subgroup of folks. Steve has been talking to the actuary's office, and they're going to look at whether that actually makes a difference using that different mortality table. I think I already said all that. Right, okay, got ahead of myself. So the question of the board is, should the cost be revisited? And so this is kind of the policy question, and I phrase it here as, does the board still support extending PEB coverage to this group? But as I look around, I realize I really kind of misphrased that, because I think the only person sitting around this table that was here in 2009 is Mark. So the first policy question is, does the board want to look at extending PEB coverage? And of course that would be subject to cost, but an earlier iteration of this board did support that, and whether the board would still support that is kind of a policy question for you folks to look at. If you wanted us to move to the next step, which would be a comprehensive report, obviously answering that question, you need to know what you're buying, how much is this going to cost. So the question for the board is, would you want staff to update the cost analysis, which would be coordinating with the actuary's office and with Healthcare Authority and trying to get an updated fiscal estimate? And then also this question, which has come up just for members, is you want to look at including the reimbursement for Medicare C and D premiums as well as the B premiums that are reimbursed under current law. Any questions for me?
Questions? Seeing none. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, so I would make a motion that we move this on to the next step in the process.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded to move this issue to our next step and revisit it in November with other information. Discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none. Anybody abstaining? None. All right, motion carries. Thank you. Good job.
All right, Mr. Chair, now we're going to shuffle up the agenda again. So item number 13, agenda items for future meetings. I mentioned earlier the next meeting is your strategic planning meeting. And I say strategic planning, and there is a lot of strategic piece about it, but it's more. It's not just. I don't want you to think that that's all it is. But we will. This is more talking about big picture items. Part of that is the board's strategic plan. What has previous iterations of the board set for future work? And that plan, usually those are 4 or 5 years. It's about ready to expire. So it's a good time to remind you guys of sort of what's on your plate, what you're doing, and why you're doing it, what Steve and the team is doing, and why we're doing it, so that as those questions come up. And then we're going to really dig into some of the decisions that the board has made in the past that now you guys have inherited to find out, do you still want to keep doing these things? So, for instance, we'll talk about your funding method. Why have you adopted a funding method that's different from the other plans? How's that worked out for you? What do you want to keep doing it? What are the pros and cons of that decision? That'll be the format. It'll be a more relaxed, a more informal type of board meeting. Not a lot of presentations like what you see today with a lot of PowerPoints. It's more interactive. What do you think? Not just here's a presentation, take a vote type of format, but a lot more discussion amongst board members in particular. I always tell board members when they're trying to work out their schedule, the October meeting and then also the December meeting are the most important. And if it's a rate-setting year, the meeting where you adopt rates. And those are the meetings where you are carrying out your statutory obligations. And so that'll be October. Not a lot of votes in October. It's more discussion. November, then we get back onto the regular schedule. And at this point in time, we're expecting to have a presentation from DRS on the customer satisfaction. We'll have a presentation from the SIB on what they're doing. We'll have follow-up presentations on the benefit issues that you are working on. And we're going to have some follow-up presentations on these actuarial issues in terms of adopting any changes to the long-term economic assumptions. We should also have, at that point in time, the final results of the latest actuarial valuation, and you'll get that information as well. That's what's currently on the agenda for November. December is where you focus, and depending on the session, you're focusing on what do you want the board, what do you want Steve to be working on with the legislature during the upcoming session. That takes place at the December meeting. And usually you don't decide that at the December meeting. The only thing I can say for sure that will be on the agenda at that time will be the final presentation on the study, because that is a legislative required action. Anything else for December will depend on the actions that you take at your November meeting. But that is the current plan. There'll be a budget update as well, and the ongoing administrative updates. But those topics are the big ones, for lack of a better word, that are on your agenda right now for October, November, and December. With that, I'd be happy to ask any questions.
Questions for Steve? All right, seeing none. So the last item we had on our agenda was breaking to executive session.
Yes. Now, historically, when we do this over at the SIB offices, we've got a separate conference room available for executive session. Unfortunately, because we're meeting here, we don't have that. So when you break into executive session, you will stay here, and then everyone else will clear the room. Tor will stay with you. Any staff Anybody from our team that you want to stay with you to help your deliberations at your request can stay with you, but the rest of the public and me and everybody else will clear the room.
Staff going to be right outside?
Yeah, I'll be right outside.
Just one other procedural requirement, or reminder, I should say. The OPMA does require that the public be given notice how long the executive session is expected to last and when the meeting will reconvene in open session, number one. And second of all, the time that a board enters into executive session, it may only do so for reasons enumerated by statute. So if I would just urge the chair to provide A, an estimate of the length of time, and B, the purpose. And I suspect that the purpose, just by way of reminder, is to evaluate and review the performance of a public employee.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, for the purpose of going into executive...
Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Are the audience going to be able to ask any questions before you adjourn?
Probably be appropriate now. Yeah.
Ask questions about what?
I just had one question. You said something at the end there about the study. What study are you referring to?
Oh, the Interrupted Military Service Credit Study.
Thank you. All right, so as we enter into executive session, we will do so for the executive director evaluation discussion. And it's 1:50. I would say we would come back about 2:20. 30 minutes, I think, would be appropriate. And if we can have staff step outside and just be available, we may need you at some point. All right, thank you. All right, we're going to reconvene our regular meeting and report back that we did discuss the evaluation process of our executive director. So back in the regular meeting. Discussion? Go ahead. Well, we don't need a second for that, not for that one, so. All right. Ade.
A motion to I would like to table a motion to authorize the chair to contact OFM to gather other information regarding the executive director's compensation.
Okay. Motion to direct the chair to contact OFM regarding compensation. Is there a second? Motion's been made and seconded. Is there discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? Motion carries. Thank you, Ade. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to motion that we direct the chair to contact the Attorney General's office on behalf of the board, requesting advice relating to the board's authority to set executive director compensation.
Motion's been made. Yeah, thank you. I was going to repeat it. Discussion on Steve's motion. Got it? Motion's made and seconded. Seeing no other discussion, all in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Nobody abstaining? Nope. Motion carries. Thank you. Is there any other motions? We would like to direct staff to prepare the policy that was put in draft form to be prepared for our October meeting for postings and or review and possible. We won't have action in October, but it would be November, correct? Can we take action in October at all?
You could. Historically, you haven't, but you could.
Okay. For the process, I think we'd like to go ahead and have it ready for discussion and possible board action. So, was there anything else before our group? Tora, we missed anything? Anybody? All right. Steve, do you have any final words?
No.
All right. Entertain a motion to...
So moved.
Oh, gotcha.
Almost.
Almost.
Just that we wanted to put these items on the agenda for October, November.
We got it. Yep. Okay. Entertain a motion to...
I moved that the board adjourn till October.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded to adjourn. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? Motion carries. Thank you.